Hello everyone and welcome to Wormwood Tales. Relax and enjoy the story for sleep video. Before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Let's begin. As Halloween night descends upon New Orleans, a chill settles over the city's historic French Quarter, its narrow, cobblestone streets cloaked in fog. Tourists and locals gather for a guided ghost tour, their destination one of the most infamous buildings in the city, La Lurie Mansion. With tales of torture, restless spirits, and a brutal mistress who roams the halls even in death, the mansion looms before them like a shadow from another world, its dark windows seeming to watch each visitor who dares enter. Among the crowd is a group of friends eager for a thrill, but noticeably uneasy. The guide, a seasoned storyteller, begins recounting the grim history of Madame Delphine La Lurie, a woman of high society with a reputation that masked horrific secrets. As the group crosses the mansion's threshold, the guide warns that some visitors have felt a heavy presence, experienced physical sensations, and even claimed to see apparitions within these walls. Halloween, he adds with a sly grin, is the night when the spirits are most active. The air inside is thick and stale, carrying a hint of decay. The narrow hallways seem to close in on them, and a faint creaking sounds from above. As they walk through the dimly lit rooms, the guide stops in front of an ornate mirror that hangs on a cracked wall. He explains that it's believed to be one of the original mirrors from Madame La Lurie's time and that her tortured victims' souls are still trapped inside. As one of the friends nervously glances into the mirror, they see a shape in the shadows, just behind them. But when they turn, there's no one there. With hearts pounding, they press forward, unaware of the chilling encounters awaiting them deeper within the mansion. The friends shuffle closer together, their footsteps echoing off the high, cold walls as the guide leads them into what he calls the Room of Shadows. Sunlight never seems to touch this part of the mansion, even in daytime, and on Halloween night, the darkness feels almost tangible, pressing in from all sides. The group's breath turns visible as the temperature inexplicably drops, filling the air with a misty chill that raises goosebumps on their skin. The guide's voice drops to a whisper as he recounts the horrors that took place here, stories of Madame La Lurie's cruelty toward her servants, of strange sounds neighbors would hear at night, and the night of the fire that exposed the mansion's darkest secrets. As he speaks, the friends notice that faint scuffling noises seem to come from the walls themselves, like scratching or scraping, a sound so faint that it's easy to dismiss as the wind. Yet, one of them swears they hear faint, muffled cries, as though someone, or something, is trying to call out from behind the walls. A girl in the group feels her arm brush against something cold and damp. She flinches, looking down, expecting to see a wet spot from the decrepit walls. Instead, her sleeve bears streaks of dark, reddish-brown stains, smeared as though someone or something tried to grasp her. Her friend laughs nervously, insisting it's probably just old paint or rust, but a feeling of dread settles in her gut, urging her to leave. Just as the guide moves to lead the group to the staircase, one of the friends is drawn to a doorway they hadn't noticed before, slightly ajar and shrouded in darkness. The guide quickly steps in, warning that this room is off limits. When they ask why, his answer chills them: not all spirits here are friendly. It's best not to wake them. But as they turn to leave, the friend who'd been near the doorway hears a faint whisper, too soft for the others to notice: "Help me." The guide continues to lead the group up a creaky staircase, his flashlight casting eerie shadows across the peeling wallpaper and faded portraits lining the walls. Each step feels heavier than the last, as though the mansion itself is resisting their presence. The air grows colder still, almost suffocating in its stillness. Whispers seem to drift through the hall, soft and unintelligible, vanishing the moment anyone tries to listen closely. As they reach the top floor, they pass by a grand, dust-covered mirror framed in tarnished gold. The guide stops and gestures toward it with a solemn expression. "This mirror," he says, "is one of the few remaining pieces from Madame La Lurie's time here. Some say it's a portal, that spirits are drawn to their reflections in it. He leans in, lowering his voice. Look closely, but don't stare too long. People have reported seeing figures in the glass, ones that aren't part of our group. The friends exchange uneasy glances but can't resist taking turns glancing into the mirror. One by one, they peer into the glass, some nervously laughing it off, others quickly averting their gaze. But one of the friends lingers, feeling an almost magnetic pull to the darkened reflection. She stares into the mirror, her eyes adjusting to the shadows, and suddenly sees a faint, pale face staring back at her. It's a woman, her hollow eyes wide and desperate, her hand pressing against the other side of the glass as though trapped within. Startled, she gasps and steps back, her heart racing. Her friends crowd around, asking what happened, but when she points to the mirror, the face is gone. The guide offers a small, knowing smile, but his eyes are wary. Not everyone sees her, he says, but those who do, they say she doesn't just stay in the mirror. They move on, shaken and eager to leave the unsettling artifact behind. But as they pass through the narrow hallway, one of the friends notices her reflection in a small mirror hanging on the opposite wall. To her horror, the pale face is still there, watching her from the shadows. A sense of dread settles over the group as they realize they're not alone and something in the house has taken an interest in them. The whispers grow louder, almost pleading, and the air thickens with an unmistakable sense of sorrow and rage, as if the walls themselves remember the horrors that once took place within. The guide takes them down a narrow, twisting corridor, the floorboards groaning beneath their feet. It's clear this part of the mansion has been largely untouched, left to decay in the years since Madame Lalaury's time. The wallpaper peels in long strips, exposing dark patches of mold, and the faint scent of something burnt lingers in the air. One friend jokes nervously about the mansion's vintage charm, but no one laughs. The mansion feels almost alive around them, watching, waiting. They stop at a doorway shrouded in shadows, and the guide hesitates before opening it. This room, he says, his voice unusually grave, was where Madame Lalaury was rumored to perform certain experiments. He doesn't elaborate, but the silence that follows is weighted with horror. The friends exchange glances, unsure if they want to know more, but curiosity wins out. They follow the guide inside, stepping over the threshold into a room that feels colder than the rest. Dust blankets every surface, but the air feels heavy, charged with an unsettling energy. The walls are covered in faint, reddish-brown stains, the shapes almost indistinct, but unmistakable. One of the friends stares, feeling sick, as she realizes the marks seem to form handprints, as though someone or something had desperately tried to escape. Her mind races, and she tries to dismiss it as her imagination, but she can't shake the feeling that someone's eyes are on her, watching from the shadows. Suddenly, a loud thud echoes from above, startling the group. The guide looks up, his expression unreadable. Old houses like this, he murmurs, have ways of making their presence known. He suggests they move on, but as they turn to leave, one of the friends feels an icy grip on her shoulder. She gasps and spins around, expecting to see one of her friends playing a trick on her, but there's no one there. Her shoulder feels cold and numb, as though something unseen had latched onto her for a brief, chilling moment. They continue down the hallway, a sense of dread building with each step. The whispers from before are louder now, almost distinct, threading through the walls like an ethereal chant. The friends are unable to understand the words, but the tone is unmistakable, pleading, frantic, angry. Just as they approach the grand staircase that leads back down to the first floor, one friend looks up and freezes. At the top of the staircase, half obscured by shadows, stands the unmistakable figure of a woman. She's dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her dark hair pulled back tightly, her eyes hollow and unblinking. Her face is pale, almost gray in the dim light, and her expression is one of deep, unsettling malice. The friend's throat tightens as he realizes he's staring at the ghostly form of Madame Lalaurie herself. "Do you see her?" he whispers to his friends, his voice barely audible. They turn to look, but by then, the figure has vanished, leaving only an impression of cold dread in her wake. Shaken, they hurry down the stairs, their hearts racing. But as they reach the bottom, they notice something that sends chills down their spines. Each of them bears the same dark, red smudges on their arms, like bloody handprints, a chilling reminder that something, or someone, has marked them as they leave Lalaurie Mansion. The guide says nothing, but his face reveals that this isn't the first time he's seen this happen. The group edges forward, the unease in the air growing thicker with each step. The dim lighting casts shadows that seem to flicker and move, like something or someone is lurking just out of view. One friend, trying to shake the nervous tension, cracks a joke, but it falls flat, swallowed by the oppressive silence. The guide's footsteps grow quieter as they approach another set of doors, and as they pass, one of the group members catches sight of something, just a flash of movement in the corner of her eye. For a moment, she wonders if it's her imagination, but when she glances back, the hallway seems to stretch on longer than before. The mansion feels larger now, as if it's shifting around them, expanding to trap them within its walls. The air smells of old wood and something bitter, a scent that makes their throats tighten. But they keep moving, driven by the sick curiosity of wanting to see more, not fully realizing that their presence here is no mere coincidence. And then it happens. A low, eerie sound echoes through the mansion, almost like a whisper at first. But this is different. The whisper isn't coming from any person in the room. It's coming from the very walls. The floor creaks as if something is shifting underneath, and for a second, every breath feels heavy and wrong. One of the friends instinctively pulls out her phone, but the screen flickers, showing only static before going black. The group freezes, unsure of what's happening. The guide's expression tightens, his jaw clenched in dread. "We should go," he mutters, his voice barely audible, though none of them are sure if it's directed at them or some unseen force. They start toward the stairs, their feet reluctant, but the moment they take a step, the faintest sound, almost like a sob, drifts down the hallway toward them. It's the sound of someone crying, but there's no one else around. As they press on, the unsettling feeling intensifies. The house seems to be alive, breathing with them, the very walls stretching, narrowing, and pulling at them. The shadows grow longer, flickering, as if the mansion itself is shifting in ways they cannot comprehend. Every corner they turn seems to lead them deeper, farther into the darkness, and yet, there's a magnetic pull, a desire to see more, to uncover the truth behind the old mansion's terrible reputation. The guide looks uneasy now, glancing over his shoulder as if checking for something or someone. His usual confidence is gone, replaced by a palpable fear. "You don't understand," he says softly, his voice quivering. "There's a reason people don't come here. It's not just the history, it's what's left behind. Something someone never left. And it's waiting." One of the group members scoffs nervously, trying to dismiss the growing tension. But before they can take another step, the sound of scraping metal echoes down the hallway. It's faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it builds, growing louder with each passing second, like chains dragging across the floor. They stop dead in their tracks, the noise now unmistakable, closer than before, as though whatever is making the sound is right behind them. The temperature in the room drops, the chill biting at their skin, and the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. Each of them wants to turn and run, but their feet are frozen, unable to move. Then, just as the scraping sound reaches its peak, a shadow darts past them so fast, they almost miss it. It's too dark to see clearly, but the shape is unmistakable, thin, hunched, like something moving with an unnatural speed. Suddenly, the guide gasps, his face pale as he stares wide-eyed at the shadows ahead. "We need to go," he urges, voice strained, but it's clear from his panicked expression that it's already too late. The group stands frozen, their hearts pounding in their chests as the eerie scraping sound grows louder. The silence between the moments feels impossibly thick, like the very air is pressing against them, suffocating them with its weight. The darkness around them seems to close in, swallowing up the flickering light from their flashlights. One of the friends, the most skeptical of the group, tries to laugh it off, a forced chuckle escaping her lips. "It's probably just the old house settling, right?" she says, but the words sound hollow, as if even she knows she's not convincing anyone. The guide doesn't respond immediately, his eyes scanning the hallway ahead, his face pale. "It's not just the house," he mutters under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something in this place. It's been here for years." Before anyone can reply, the scraping sound stops abruptly, leaving a sudden, unnerving silence that seems to hang in the air. The tension is unbearable, and for a moment, it feels like they've all collectively held their breath, waiting for the next sound, the next sign that something is terribly wrong. Then, in the silence, a soft whisper fills the air, a voice, cold and distant, like a breath just behind their ears. "Help me." The group shudders, looking around in confusion. No one spoke. The voice wasn't human, it wasn't even a voice at all. It was a distorted, broken sound, like something trapped in time, pleading to be freed. The temperature in the hallway plummets, and their breath starts to fog in the air. No one speaks. The voice, now louder, more desperate, sounds as though it's coming from behind them, from the darkness they just passed. Slowly, cautiously, they turn around. A figure stands in the hallway behind them, barely visible, its shape twisted and warped. The pale, skeletal frame of a woman, her long, matted hair hanging around her face like a curtain. Her clothes are torn, stained, the remnants of what might have been an elegant gown, now reduced to ragged strips of fabric. The faintest hint of blood stains her hands as she reaches toward them, fingers long and unnaturally thin, as though they've been stretched by some invisible force. The group stumbles backward, their hearts racing in unison. One of the friends lets out a breathless scream, but it's swallowed by the oppressive air around them. The figure's eyes, a hollow, empty void, lock onto one of them, and a whisper floats on the cold air, just loud enough for them to hear. "You shouldn't have come." The group starts to move, but their feet feel glued to the floor, weighed down by a presence they can't see but can certainly feel. They look to the guide, their eyes wide with terror, hoping for some explanation, some reassurance that they'll be safe. But the guide looks just as terrified as they feel. His face is ashen, his mouth moving but no words escaping. Before they can react, the figure takes a step forward, its long, thin arms reaching out. The sound of chains dragging across the floor fills the air, and they realize that sound, it's not just a noise. It's the sound of something or someone trapped, imprisoned, desperate. The figure lets out a low, guttural cry, a mix of anguish and rage. "Help me," it moans, the words twisted and broken. The voice seems to reverberate through the very walls, shaking the foundation of the mansion. The air becomes thick with the smell of decay, of death. The temperature drops even further, until their breath is visible in the freezing air. Without warning, the figure lunges forward, its hands stretching out to grab one of them. They scramble, rushing back down the hallway, tripping over each other, desperate to escape the cold, icy grip that seems to reach for them from all directions. But as they run, the mansion shifts around them. The hallway, once familiar, is now a maze. The walls seem to close in, the path ahead becoming a series of tight, winding corridors, each one darker and more oppressive than the last. The sound of chains dragging behind them grows louder, the growl of something not human echoing off the walls. They can feel it now, the mansion itself is alive. One of the group members finally looks behind them, and her blood runs cold. The figure, no longer just a woman, but a twisted, gnarled shadow of what it once was, is crawling toward them, its limbs contorted in unnatural ways, dragging its broken body across the floor. The chains are still clanging, and the growls, those low, animalistic sounds, are growing louder, closer. Run! The guide yells, his voice breaking with panic. But there's no time. The hallway splits, and they have no choice but to take the first turn they find. The walls seem to close in on them, and the air grows even colder, the whispers from the shadows pressing against their ears. Then, suddenly, the door to the outside, the exit, appears in front of them, like a beacon of salvation. But as they rush toward it, their hands outstretched toward freedom, the door slams shut with a deafening crash. It's locked. They try to pry the door open, panic setting in as the growls grow louder, the chains dragging closer. Their breaths are shallow now, the air too cold to breathe. The figure is closer than ever, its twisted form almost upon them. They turn to face each other, realizing that they're trapped inside with no escape. But as the figure reaches for them, its eyes empty, its mouth stretched into a horrific grin, a voice echoes in their minds, "No one leaves." The group stumbles backward in fear as the figure inches closer, its skin stretched tight over skeletal bones, its eyes hollow and vacant. The chains dragging behind it seem to rattle with each movement, and the very air around them grows heavier, colder, suffocating. It's as if the mansion itself is feeding off their fear, tightening its grip, pulling them deeper into its nightmarish labyrinth. The door, once their beacon of safety, remains firmly shut, mocking them. No matter how hard they push or pull, it won't budge. Panic surges through their veins, a cold sweat slicking their backs as the figure advances, its twisted face contorting into something that was once human, but now is a grotesque mask of suffering. One of the group members, her voice trembling with desperation, cries out, "We need to find another way out. Now." But the words are lost in the howling winds that suddenly fill the room. The sound is deafening, as if the mansion itself is roaring, angry at their intrusion, at their attempt to leave. The walls begin to shake, a low groaning filling the air, the sound of the house shifting, changing, evolving into something darker. The figure lunges forward, its long, bony fingers reaching out, but just before it can touch them, the group scatters in different directions, scrambling through the narrow hallways, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. The light from their flashlights flickers, casting haunting shadows on the walls. They run blindly, not sure where they're going, only knowing that they have to escape. But the mansion seems to stretch endlessly, corridors winding in ways that make no sense, as if the building itself is alive, aware of their every move. With each turn, the darkness seems to deepen, swallowing them whole. In one hallway, they stumble upon a strange room, its door half open. The room is eerily silent, and the air within feels thick and heavy. But inside, the walls are lined with old portraits of faces that seem to watch them, their eyes following their every move. The paintings are old, faded with age, but something about them is off. The faces, once proud and dignified, now seem twisted, their expressions pained and distorted. One of the friends, feeling drawn to the room, steps closer to the portraits. "What is this place?" she whispers, her voice barely audible. As her fingers graze the frame of one painting, she gasps in shock. The eyes of the figure in the painting, an old woman with a twisted smile, appear to blink. Before she can react, a sharp cry pierces the silence. Another friend has disappeared down a darkened hallway, and they rush after him, the fear now a sharp, biting edge in their hearts. The house seems to pulse with energy, its sinister power growing stronger with each passing moment. They find him at the end of the hallway, his body stiff and frozen in place, staring ahead with wide, terrified eyes. He doesn't speak. He can't. His mouth is agape in a silent scream, but no sound escapes. Something is holding him there, paralyzing him with terror. His fingers twitch, clawing at the air, but it's as if something invisible is preventing him from moving. With a desperate scream, They pull him away, but it's as if the very mansion itself is pushing back. The walls groan again, the floorboards creak beneath them. The temperature drops even further, so cold that their breath crystallizes in the air. Their friend's eyes snap toward them, wide and terrified, but he doesn't say a word. He can't. The chain rattling sound returns, louder than before, echoing through the hallways. It's no longer just the sound of chains dragging, it's the sound of something massive, something alive, moving in the dark. "Help me," a voice whispers again, but this time, it's not coming from the figure. It's coming from the walls themselves. The walls are alive, pulsating with the whispers of those trapped within the mansion's cursed history. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shakes. The walls crack, and a strange, blood-curdling wail erupts from deep within the mansion. The house seems to groan, as if it's aware of their presence, aware of their defiance. The portraits in the room begin to move, their painted eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The once peaceful faces twist into grotesque, screaming visages, mouths gaping open in eternal, silent cries. One of the portraits, a painting of a man in a top hat, begins to speak. His lips move slowly, the words barely comprehensible, but the meaning is unmistakable: "You should not have come." With a sudden, violent motion, the room begins to collapse inward. The walls close in on them, the ceiling lowering as if the house is trying to crush them alive. The group runs again, but this time, it feels hopeless. They can't escape. The darkness is too thick, the shadows too deep. As they sprint through the hallways, the mansion seems to shift with them. The floor beneath their feet begins to bend and warp, the ceiling groaning in protest. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing glimpses of the twisted figure they've been running from, its face no longer human, but a mass of distorted features, eyes bulging from its skull, its mouth hanging open in an eternal scream. It's getting closer. They can hear its chains scraping against the floor, feel the chill of its breath on their skin. Just as they think they've reached the door, their last hope of escape, it slams shut with an unholy crash. The sound reverberates through the house, echoing in their ears. They're trapped. There's nowhere left to run. The figure looms behind them, its long, clawed fingers stretching toward them. "No one leaves," it whispers. The lights flicker once, then go out. The darkness is absolute. The sudden loss of light feels like a physical blow, suffocating and overwhelming. Their hearts pound in the silence, deafening in its intensity, as the cold in the air thickens. They can no longer hear the sounds of their own breath, only the scraping of chains, louder now, so close that it feels like the very walls are trembling in time with it. The figure is just behind them. They can feel its presence like an icy chill creeping up their spines, its shadow hanging over them, suffocating them in its dark embrace. Every step they take, every move they make, is shadowed by the creeping dread that something is watching, waiting. Then, a voice cuts through the blackness, sharp and hollow, like the echo of something ancient. No one escapes. It croons, its words slow, deliberate, filled with malice. The sound of chains dragging is deafening now, as though something is dragging itself across the floor, inch by agonizing inch. They spin around, their hands trembling as they fumble for their flashlights, but there is no beam, no light. The darkness has swallowed everything. Suddenly, a soft glow appears in the distance. It flickers, weak and unstable, like a candle caught in the wind. Desperate for any sign of hope, they begin to move toward it, their legs heavy, as if they're wading through water. With every step, the glow grows brighter, until they see a figure slightly familiar, but wrong. It's the guide, standing in front of a door they hadn't noticed before, his face pale, his expression twisted in something between terror and defeat. His mouth moves, but no words come out. He's just standing there, eyes wide, frozen in place. The figure behind them is closer now. They can hear its breathing, a deep, ragged sound that seems to resonate from somewhere deep within the mansion's heart. It's as if the house itself is inhaling and exhaling, alive and breathing with them. The glow from the guide flickers one last time before it dies out, plunging them back into an even darker night. The door that had seemed like salvation now appears to be a trap. A distant, cold laugh echoes from within. "Leave now, or die with the rest," the voice whispers, but this time, it's not coming from the figure. It's coming from everywhere: the walls, the floors, the ceilings. It's as if the house itself is alive, speaking to them, warning them. The very stones around them seem to groan in protest, the air thick with the weight of something ancient and unforgiving. They turn to the guide, whose eyes are locked onto them, wide with terror, his body stiff and unmoving. "Help me," he mouths silently, but it's clear that whatever force has taken hold of this place has also taken hold of him. A cold, brutal gust of wind tears through the hallway, knocking them off balance. It feels like the house is alive, its breath choking them, pushing them into the very walls. The windows shake violently as if something is trying to break through. The walls appear to be shifting, warping, as though they are no longer solid, they are alive. Suddenly, the chains stop dragging. Silence. The quiet is oppressive, too quiet, and their bodies are stiff with fear. Then, the silence is shattered by a deafening crash. The door slams open, revealing what's beyond. A room bathed in darkness. The outline of the figure, the twisted woman from before, stands just inside, its face obscured by shadows, its hands reaching out. The guide is gone. They rush toward the door, but as they cross the threshold, the world shifts. The room behind them seems to stretch, becoming a vast, hollow void. They're no longer in the mansion. Instead, they're standing in a strange, empty space, suspended in the dark. The ground beneath their feet begins to crumble, revealing a vast abyss of darkness stretching infinitely below. The walls are covered in ancient symbols, scratched into the stone, glowing faintly in the darkness, pulsing with an unnatural light. The walls seem to close in, compressing the space around them. And then, the figure steps forward. It's taller now, its features more grotesque, its face completely obscured by long, tangled hair. Its arms are impossibly long, and the chains it drags behind it seem to move of their own accord, wrapping themselves around its body like an extension of its being. It speaks again, its voice reverberating in their minds, the words no longer a whisper but a command: "You are trapped, you cannot leave." The chains, once dragging behind it, now begin to coil like serpents, creeping toward the group. The air becomes suffocating, and they realize too late this is the true horror of the mansion. Their vision is clouding, the darkness pressing in on them, drowning them. The chains begin to wrap around their bodies, pulling them toward the figure. As they struggle, fighting the relentless pull, one of them reaches out in desperation, trying to tear at the chains that hold them, but they slip through their fingers like smoke. They scream, but their cries are swallowed by the abyss. Their bodies freeze, unable to move, unable to escape. The chains bind them tighter, until they can no longer breathe. The last thing they hear before everything goes black is the figure's voice, cold and merciless. "You are one of us now." The darkness closes in, thick and suffocating. They are no longer sure if they are still inside the mansion or trapped in some twisted version of it. The air is frigid, the weight of the silence pressing down on them like an unrelenting hand. The chains they're rattling was the last thing they heard, the last thing they knew for certain. But now, even that sound seems to have disappeared, swallowed by the deep, unearthly silence that surrounds them. A low, creaking sound begins to echo through the space, faint at first, like the groan of an old house settling. But the creaking grows louder, more frantic, as if something inside the very walls of the mansion is trying to escape. The stone beneath their feet begins to vibrate, the cracks in the walls widening, as though the mansion is alive, breathing in time with their panic. Their flashlights, weak and dim, flicker in the oppressive dark. The beams of light cast eerie shadows that twist and contort, as if the darkness is alive, shifting with each heartbeat. For a moment, they are paralyzed, staring into the shadows, unsure if the walls are closing in or if they're simply imagining it. One of them, her breath shallow and quick, whispers, "Is it getting smaller in here? Are we moving?" But no one answers. No one dares to speak. The weight of the air is too heavy, as if each breath is a struggle. Then, just when they think they can't take the silence any longer, a sound, a soft, distant whisper echoes through the air. It's so faint, they almost don't hear it. But when they do, their blood runs cold. "Help me." The voice is unmistakable. It's the guide. But his voice sounds different now, twisted, distorted, as though it's being pulled through thick mud. The words are strangled, barely a breath, but they echo through the space like a warning, a plea for mercy. The ground beneath their feet shifts again, this time with more force, causing them to stagger. A low rumbling follows, as though the very earth beneath the mansion is shifting, cracking, ready to collapse. Panic rises. They try to move, but their legs feel heavy, unresponsive. They're stuck in the same spot, as if the air itself is holding them in place. The shadows around them seem to grow longer, stretching toward them, as if they're being drawn into the darkness. Then, they see it. Out of the corner of their eyes, a shape, no, several shapes move within the shadows. The figures are faint at first, mere outlines against the dark. But as they stare, they begin to take form, twisted figures, hunched and writhing, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Their bodies seem to flicker in and out of existence, as if they are not fully part of this world, but something else entirely. The air grows colder, colder still, until they can see their breath clouding in front of them. The figures in the shadows seem to pause, then slowly move toward them, their eyes gleaming with an unnatural hunger. "Run." One of them finally manages to gasp, and the others snap into motion. They race down what they think is a hallway, but it feels wrong. The floorboards creak beneath them, each step louder than the last. The air grows heavier, pressing against their chests as they run, the walls now seeming to lean in, closing them off, forcing them in one direction. Behind them, they hear the sound again. The dragging chains. Closer. The floor beneath their feet gives way with a sudden, violent jolt. They stumble, their feet slipping, and for a moment, they feel themselves falling. A gasp escapes one of them as they find themselves tumbling down a narrow staircase they didn't know was there. They crash to the ground, disoriented, their bodies bruised and aching. When they open their eyes, they find themselves in a new room. The air is thick with the stench of decay, the walls covered in peeling wallpaper that seems to shift before their eyes. Strange symbols are scrawled on the floor, the walls, the ceiling, as though someone or something has been marking the room for centuries. At the far end of the room, a figure stands in the dark. It's the same twisted woman. Her hair hangs in tangled clumps, her face a mask of agony, her eyes gleaming with malevolent satisfaction. Her body is unnaturally still, as if waiting, watching them. But her presence is not what freezes them in place. It's the feeling that something is behind them. Something that has been waiting for them all along. They turn slowly, their hearts pounding in their chests, and there, in the far corner of the room, they see it. A door. A small door, half hidden in shadow. Its edges are rotted, but it's still there. Their only chance. "We have to go," one of them gasps, and they begin to run toward the door. But as they move closer, they feel the air shift. The temperature drops. The room seems to stretch further away, as if the walls are pushing them back. The closer they get to the door, the heavier the air becomes, until it feels like they're moving through thick water. They reach for the door handle, but it won't turn. It's stuck, locked, as if something is holding it shut from the other side. Then, the figure steps forward, its chains clinking loudly as it moves. The light from their flashlights flickers once more, casting shadows on the walls. They turn back, but the figure is closer now, right behind them, its breath cold and foul against their necks. It speaks again, its voice now clearer, more commanding, and inescapable, "You cannot leave." And with that, the door behind them slams shut with a violent crash, the sound echoing in their ears as the darkness consumes them once more. The door slams shut, and the room goes pitch black, the shadows swallowing them whole. The air around them feels thick, heavier than before, as if something is pressing down, suffocating them. The coldness gnaws at their skin, a bitter, bone-chilling chill that sinks deep into their bones. Their breath comes in short, sharp gasps, their hearts hammering as the terror seeps in deeper. One of them, the one closest to the door, slams her fist against it, desperate to open it, but it's no use. The door won't budge. It's as though it's been sealed by an unseen force, locked away from the inside. It's no use. It's locked. It's over. Her voice cracks, trembling with disbelief. They can all feel it now, their escape is no longer an option. They are trapped. The weight of that realization settles over them like a lead blanket, pressing down with unbearable heaviness. A low, guttural sound erupts from the darkness, sending their bodies into a state of frantic panic. The scraping of chains, the slow, deliberate drag of metal on stone, is unmistakable, and it is coming closer. They turn, eyes wide with fear, but they can't see anything. The darkness is absolute, suffocating, making it impossible to tell what's in front of them or behind them. The faint glow of their dying flashlights only highlights the sheer scale of their dread, their limited vision amplifying the terror creeping up their spines. Suddenly, a figure appears. It's too blurry, too indistinct at first to recognize, but as it draws closer, the details become clearer, though none of them want to see it. The twisted woman steps into their field of vision, her face a grotesque mask of hunger and malice. Her eyes gleam, a sickly shade of yellow in the faint light. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispers, her voice distorted, like 1,000 voices speaking at once. The sound seems to reverberate around the room, a constant hum in the air, filling every corner, growing louder and louder until it drowns out all other sound. But it's not her words that hold them in place. It's the feeling, the sensation that the room is changing again, shifting in ways they can't comprehend. The walls pulse with an unnatural rhythm, the floor trembling beneath their feet. The air becomes thick, almost viscous, pressing against their skin. One of them steps forward, trembling, their voice barely audible. "Who are you?" The figure, once so distant, moves closer still, and as it does, the temperature drops even further. Their breath now comes out in visible clouds, freezing in the air before them. They can feel the weight of her presence like a shadow crushing the life from them. "You want to know who I am?" the figure asks, her lips curling into a twisted smile. "I am the keeper of this house. The one who guards its secrets." The room spins. Their vision blurs. They try to move, but their bodies feel heavy, sluggish. It's as though the house itself is resisting them, trying to keep them in place. The pressure in the air grows unbearable, like being caught in a storm, each moment filled with the dread of the unknown. The woman moves again, and this time, they can see her more clearly, her hair hanging in matted strands, her skin pale and cracked like old porcelain. Her arms are long, unnaturally so, her fingers twisted in impossible angles. She reaches for them, her fingers stretching out like tendrils, closing the gap between them. The walls seem to close in around them. Every corner is dark, every shadow a potential danger. They can feel the walls pressing against them, trapping them, the very air heavy with the weight of something ancient, something evil. "Why are we here? What do you want?" One of them manages to whisper, voice trembling. The fear is evident in their tone, the desperation, the need for answers in the face of such overwhelming terror. The woman smiles again, her lips pulling back from her teeth, which are unnaturally sharp. "You are here because you belong here," she says, her voice low and cold. "You are here because you have already been marked. There is no escape. There never was." The room trembles violently, and they stumble back, their hearts racing. The shadows grow even darker, swirling around them as if the very air is alive, feeding off their fear. They realize then they are not alone in the room. There are others. They can hear them now, the soft shuffle of footsteps in the darkness, the faint sound of whispers, like a chorus of voices, each one calling out, begging for something they can't understand. Their eyes frantically scan the room, but the shadows hide everything except for the eyes. Eyes that blink, that gleam in the dark, unblinking, watching them from every angle. "What is this place?" one of them cries out in desperation. "What's happening?" The woman cackles, a dry, hollow sound that makes their blood run cold. "This is your new home," she whispers, her voice now a soft, taunting hiss. "This is the end of your story, where time doesn't pass, where the shadows live. This is where the lost ones stay, forever." The shadows move again, and this time, they feel it's something behind them, its breath hot on their necks. The walls seem to pulse as though the house is alive, aware, feeding off their fear. And in that moment, they realize this is not just a house. This is a prison. And there is no escape. The chains, the dragging chains they've been hearing this entire time, are closing in. They can hear them now, far too close. The dragging is unmistakable, the sound of metal scraping against the stone floor, growing louder, closer, until a figure steps out of the shadows, tall and imposing, its face hidden behind a mask of darkness. The chains are wrapped around its limbs, rattling as it moves. "No one escapes the house," it whispers in a voice that echoes through their very souls. "Not now. Not ever." And with that, the walls close in tighter, the air too thick to breathe, and the darkness consumes them whole. The chains scrape against the floor louder now, as though the room itself is breathing, pulsing with each dragged step. The air grows colder still, until their teeth begin to chatter involuntarily, a shiver running through their entire bodies. The temperature is so low now that it feels like their very bones are freezing, but it's not just the cold they fear. It's the suffocating weight of what is happening to them. The room has become something else, something unrecognizable. The walls seem to bend and ripple, and the once familiar door now seems miles away, as though the room itself is stretching, pulling them further into its depths. The shadows that once lingered in the corners now writhe, snaking their way along the floor, creeping ever closer to the group. They're all aware now deep down, in the hollow pit of their stomachs, that this is no longer an ordinary haunted house. No. This place is alive, and it's hungry. It is feeding on their fear, on their despair. The woman steps forward again, her face now twisted, her once serene expression now contorted with hunger and malice. The smile on her lips is grotesque, far too wide, as though her mouth cannot contain the darkness inside her. "You see, you were never meant to leave," she whispers, her voice low and sinister. "The moment you set foot in this house, you became part of its story. And stories, my dears, never have happy endings." Her words hang in the air, heavy and suffocating, like the weight of an invisible hand pressing down on their chests. One of them stumbles backward, but their feet seem to be stuck to the floor, as though the very ground beneath them has turned to quicksand. "Why are you doing this?" one of them cries out in desperation, their voice trembling with terror. "What do you want from us?" The woman tilts her head, her eyes glinting with a sick, twisted amusement. "I don't want anything," she says, her voice dripping with venom. "You've already given me what I need, your souls, your fear. And now, you'll stay here, with us, forever." The darkness in the room seems to close in tighter, suffocating their ability to think clearly. The shadows shift, grow restless, like they are moving in anticipation of something. Suddenly, one of the other figures, this time a man, his face gaunt and hollow, lurches forward, his hands outstretched as if to grab hold of them. His breath is shallow and raspy, and his eyes gleam with an eerie hunger. "You will join us," he croaks, his voice like gravel. "We never leave. And neither will you." As if on cue, the others, the silent figures in the shadows, begin to move. Slowly at first, but then faster, quicker, until they are surrounding them. The group tries to move, to back away, but their feet are rooted to the spot. The shadows are closing in from all sides, and the room, once so large, now feels claustrophobic. The woman's voice rises again, a haunting melody that seems to resonate in the very air. "You can scream," she taunts, "but no one will hear you. You can run, but the house will find you. There is no escape from here. There is only us." Her form flickers, blurring at the edges, as if reality itself is warping around her. She is no longer human, at least not in the way they understand. She is something else, something ancient, something that exists beyond the laws of time and space. The man with the chains lets out a guttural laugh, his teeth sharp and jagged. "Do you feel it?" he hisses, stepping closer. "The house, it's feeding. It's taking you in. Every breath you take, every fear you feel, it makes you one of us." The shadows around them seem to pulse, like the beating heart of the house itself, a constant reminder of their entrapment. The figures are everywhere now, their eyes glowing, their bodies no longer entirely human. They are twisted, malformed versions of people who had once been alive. The air thickens with the stench of decay, of long-forgotten souls who have been absorbed by the house, now nothing but hollow shells of their former selves. A hand cold as ice suddenly grips one of them by the wrist, pulling them back. They scream, but the sound is muffled, as though their voices are being swallowed by the very walls. Another figure steps forward, its eyes wide with madness, its mouth hanging open in a silent scream. "Please," one of the group begs, voice breaking, "we didn't mean to, we didn't know. Please, let us go." But the woman only smiles, her teeth glinting in the dim light. "It's too late for please," she whispers. "Too late to turn back. You should never have come here. You should never have opened that door." And as if her words have triggered something, the house responds. The walls groan, and the floor shifts beneath their feet, twisting and warping. The house is alive, and it is angry. It is as though it is taking them deeper into its core, dragging them into the heart of its darkness. The figures move closer, reaching out with twisted hands, their voices rising in a chorus of grotesque whispers. "You will stay with us, forever," they chant, their voices blending into one terrifying symphony of madness. A scream erupts from one of them, but it is quickly swallowed by the darkness. They are no longer in control. They are nothing but pieces in the house's twisted game, and the house is winning. The shadows close in tighter, and the woman's voice, now a low, resonating hum, fills the air, vibrating in their bones. "You are already ours." The figures lunge, their hands outstretched, and the room goes black. The shadows grow restless, as if sensing their mounting fear. They crawl along the floor like black tendrils, reaching for the group, wrapping around their ankles, tugging them toward the center of the room. The figures in the corners seem to grow larger, their faces becoming clearer, twisted, contorted, their eyes wide with madness. Some have no mouths, only empty voids where their screams once were. The woman's form flickers again, her figure distorting as she steps toward them, her once calm demeanor now replaced with something darker, something ancient. She opens her mouth, and the words that spill from her lips are not hers. The voice is deeper, guttural, as though something far older and more sinister has taken hold of her. "Do you feel it?" The voice echoes, a low, resonating growl that vibrates through their bones. The house is feeding. And now, you are the feast. The words ring in their ears, like a warning and a curse all at once. They can hear it now, the faint, rhythmic pounding coming from somewhere deep within the walls. It's as though the house itself is alive, its pulse, its hunger, echoing through the floorboards, the ceiling, and the very air they breathe. One of them tries to move, but their legs won't cooperate, frozen by the overpowering sense of dread. The others follow suit, each of them feeling the paralyzing grip of fear, tightening around their chests, choking out any hope of escape. It's as though the house is reaching into their minds, controlling them, shaping their very thoughts. The man with the chains lurches forward, his hands outstretched, dragging the heavy links across the floor in a sound that makes their skin crawl. His eyes gleam with a hollow, unnatural light as he approaches one of them. "You're all the same," he rasps, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. "We were once like you. We thought we could escape, but we didn't understand. We didn't know the house would take us, too." His words make them shudder, as the full horror of their situation begins to sink in. It's not just a haunting. It's not just a ghost story. The house is alive, and it has been feeding on those who entered before them, twisting them into something else, something unrecognizable. There is no escape. Not for them. Not for anyone. A cold wind rushes through the room, sending a chill down their spines. The air grows thick, and they can hear the sound of whispers, soft at first, then louder, more insistent, as if the house itself is speaking to them. "You will become one of us," the whispers chant, a chorus of voices that rise from the shadows. "You will stay. Forever." Panic sets in as the group begins to realize the full extent of their situation. One by one, they start to tremble, their minds unraveling as the reality of their predicament takes root. The house is not just haunted. It's a prison, a trap designed to keep them here, in its cold, suffocating embrace. There is no way out. Not unless they give in. "Please, no." One of them screams, their voice raw with terror. But the sound is quickly swallowed by the room, as though the very walls are devouring their cries. The woman's smile widens, and she steps closer, her movements fluid and unnatural. "You will beg for release," she says softly, her voice now laced with a strange sweetness that makes their skin crawl. "But it won't come. Not until we're done with you." The man with chains grins, his mouth stretching too wide for a human face. "You'll join us," he mutters, his voice barely audible. "We are the ones who stayed too long. The ones who didn't leave when they could. And now we are part of the house. The house will never let us go." Their screams, loud and frantic, fill the room as the shadows begin to move faster. The floor beneath their feet feels as if it's shifting, warping, as if the house is alive, breathing beneath them. The walls seem to grow closer, the space narrowing until it feels as though the room is closing in around them. In the distance, they hear the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. Each footfall echoes through the house, sending ripples of dread through their bodies. The figures surrounding them take a step back, their eyes flicking toward the sound. The man with chains stops, his expression becoming even more twisted as he watches the shadows shift in the corner of the room. "It's coming," he whispers. "We can't stop it. No one can." The whispers grow louder, more urgent, as if the house itself is alive, speaking directly to them, urging them to listen, to understand. "You are ours now." They try to scream again, but their voices are drowned out by the growing crescendo of the whispers. The house itself seems to hum, vibrating with an eerie, unnatural energy. The woman's figure flickers again, her eyes now glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. "There is no escape," she repeats, her voice soft, but filled with an undeniable certainty. "You belong to us now. Forever." The shadows surge forward, a wave of darkness that engulfs them, sweeping over them like a flood. The man with chains lunges at one of them, his hands closing around their throat, his grip icy cold. They gasp for air, but the pressure of his fingers tightens, choking out their screams. The room spins, the walls warping and bending. The cold grows unbearable, sinking into their very souls. And as the darkness closes in, they feel it, the weight of the house settling into their bones, wrapping them in its grip, pulling them down into the depths. The last thing they hear before the darkness overtakes them is the sound of the woman's voice, soft and final. "Welcome to your new home." The room is now fully consumed by darkness, the oppressive silence broken only by the sound of ragged breathing and the creaking of the floor beneath their feet. The shadows around them are no longer still, they move, twisting and writhing like living things, inching closer with each breath they take. The cold, unrelenting, seeps into their skin, making their bones ache with the weight of an invisible presence pressing down on them. One of the group members falls to their knees, their hands clutching at their chest, gasping for air. The pressure in the room is suffocating, and the fear clawing at their insides feels more real than anything they've ever experienced. It's as though the very essence of the house is seeping into their minds, tearing apart their sense of reality, replacing it with a nightmare that seems to stretch beyond time and reason. Another member tries to scream, but no sound comes out, only a strangled, gasping noise as they claw at their throat. Their eyes widen in horror as they realize the air itself seems to be thicker, harder to breathe. It's as if the house is consuming not just their bodies, but their very souls. "Please, please let us go." One of them whimpers, their voice trembling with desperation. "We didn't mean to, we didn't know." The woman, her smile now a twisted mockery of something human, steps forward. Her eyes gleam with a mixture of sorrow and amusement, as though she takes pleasure in their suffering. "You were warned," she says softly, her voice laced with an eerie calmness. "You came here willingly. You chose to open the door. Now, there's no going back." The air grows colder, so cold that their breath forms thick, frosty clouds in front of them. But even the cold is nothing compared to the sensation of being watched. The darkness is not just a physical presence, it is watching them, waiting for them to give in, to accept their fate. The walls close in slowly, creeping ever inward, pushing them tighter together as the shadows seem to grow larger, reaching for them. Each person feels it, an unrelenting pressure building within their chest, as if something is slowly squeezing the life out of them. The darkness consumes everything, every thought, every sound, every breath. The house is feeding, and they are the prey. The feeling of helplessness is overwhelming. "We're trapped," one of them whispers, the panic creeping into their voice. "We can't get out. We can't." The woman's face twists into a grotesque grin. "Of course you're trapped," she says, her voice low and mocking. "The house has always claimed its victims. You are nothing more than the next chapter in its story. And when it's done with you..." She pauses, letting the weight of her words hang in the air like a suffocating fog. Her eyes darken. "When it's done, you will become part of the house, just like us. Forever." The room goes silent, save for the low, rhythmic thumping coming from deep within the walls. It's as if the house itself is breathing, its pulse echoing through the floorboards. The shadows seem to grow darker still, swallowing everything in their path, until there is nothing left but the oppressive, soul-crushing darkness. The figures begin to move again, slowly at first, but then faster, circling them like wolves closing in on their prey. One of the group members, a young woman, suddenly bolts toward the door. Her eyes are wild, desperate. She screams as she reaches for the handle, but her fingers meet nothing but air. The door is gone, vanished into the same darkness that surrounds them. "No. Please," she cries, her voice breaking. "I just want to get out." But the shadows respond, swirling faster, twisting in on themselves. One of the figures steps forward, its form half human, half shadow. Its face is a grotesque mask of agony, its eyes empty sockets that seem to draw the light from the room. It reaches out with long, bony fingers and grabs her by the arm. "You should have listened," it hisses, its voice hollow and chilling. "You cannot leave." The woman screams again, but it's a sound so tortured, so broken, it's hard to tell if she's still truly human. The figure drags her back toward the center of the room, where the darkness seems to swallow her whole. The others try to move, but their feet are glued to the floor. It's as though the house itself has taken hold of them, anchoring them in place, forcing them to watch the horrors unfold. They want to help her, to scream, but their voices are trapped inside their throats. Their bodies are frozen, locked in a state of terror too intense to comprehend. The woman with the twisted smile steps forward again. Her eyes gleam with a sick satisfaction as she watches the horror unfold. "This is how it ends," she murmurs, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is how it always ends." The house claims what it's owed. The shadows surge, reaching for the remaining group members, their cold, groping hands like tendrils of night, pulling them into the abyss. They fight, scratching, kicking, clawing at the air, but it's useless. They are no longer in control. They are puppets in the hands of something far older, something far more powerful than they can ever understand. One final scream echoes through the room as the last person is engulfed in darkness. And then silence. The room, once filled with life and sound, is now empty. The house, quiet once more, breathes a slow, satisfied sigh, as though content with its feast. The figures in the shadows stand still now, their forms fading back into the corners, awaiting the next unwitting victims to cross their threshold. The house waits, patient, timeless, as it always has. And somewhere in the darkness, the sound of chains scraping against the floor echoes once more. As the last of the group disappears into the darkness, the house remains still, silent. But the eerie feeling never fades. There is something unsettling about this silence, something off. The air feels thicker than ever, as though it's holding its breath, waiting. Outside, the wind howls louder, as though trying to reach the abandoned house, pleading for something, or someone. But the house, nestled deep within the forest, remains untouched. The world outside seems far away, distant, nothing but a fleeting memory. A single light flickers in one of the upstairs windows, one that wasn't there before. But no one is left to notice. Somewhere far beneath the house, deep in the bowels of its foundation, something stirs. It begins as a low, rumbling sound, like the groan of an ancient beast awakening from a long, uneasy slumber. The walls tremble slightly, and a cold breeze flows through the cracks in the floor, carrying with it a faint, hollow whisper. It's not over. The whisper is barely audible at first, but then it grows louder, sharper, reverberating through the very bones of the house. The voice is familiar, it's the same voice the woman had spoken in, the one that had cursed them all. The darkness shifts. It moves in strange, unnatural ways, and with it comes a thick, heavy air, one that feels like it's suffocating, weighing down on everything, like the house itself is growing, expanding. The floors creak, the walls groan under an unseen pressure, as if the house is preparing for something far worse. Suddenly, the faintest sound breaks the silence. A thudding. It starts low, rhythmic, like footsteps echoing from the depths of the house. But these footsteps are not human. The sound is too heavy, too deliberate. The steps grow louder, one after another, filling the empty space with a growing sense of dread. The front door bursts open, slamming against the walls with a deafening crash. But there is no one standing there. The doorway is empty, but the air is thick with the sense of something watching, waiting. And then, in the corner of the room near the stairs, near where the shadows had once been, is a figure. It is tall and impossibly still, but there's something undeniably wrong about it. It seems to flicker, like a mirage or a shadow cast in an unnatural light, stretching and shrinking in time with the house's pulse. It watches with hollow eyes, its face blank and expressionless. And then, it moves. The figure steps forward with a slow, deliberate pace, as if it's unsure whether it's truly alive or still bound by the ancient forces of the house. The shadows that had once seemed to haunt the house now gather around it, forming a cloak of darkness that seems to suck in all light. Each step it takes echoes through the house, reverberating off the walls and sending a shiver through the very air. It doesn't make a sound, not a whisper of a breath, but its presence is undeniable. There's something about it, something that makes the very space around it distort, as though it's an impossible entity that shouldn't be here, shouldn't exist. It's not the woman. It's not the man with chains. No, this figure is something far more terrifying, something that doesn't belong in this world. The door slams shut once more, and the house goes silent again. But the figure remains standing still, watching. Then, a final whisper escapes the darkness. It's soft, barely audible. But it's enough to freeze the blood in your veins. You shouldn't have come. With that, the house falls completely still. But the unease lingers. What does the figure want? What is it? What will happen next? The air in the house hangs heavy with an unnatural stillness, the silence broken only by the faintest echo of distant footsteps, as though something or someone is moving far below. The figure in the doorway is no longer there, but the shadows it left behind linger, stretching unnaturally along the walls. The oppressive presence still clings to the room, thick and suffocating. Outside, the storm that had been raging earlier has died down, leaving the night eerily calm. The wind no longer howls, but a cold mist rolls in from the forest, creeping across the ground like the fingers of some unseen hand. It seeps into the cracks in the house's foundation, as though it, too, is searching for something. But inside, there is no escape. The walls seem to close in, the floors groan with the weight of ancient secrets, and the shadows are alive, swirling with a malevolent energy. The door, once slammed shut, stands wide open now, inviting anyone foolish enough to step through. The whispers return. It's never over. A soft, mournful sound echoes from the depths of the house, as if the spirits of those who came before are still trapped within its walls. Their cries, faint and distant, are a constant reminder that the house, its evil, never truly releases its grip. It waits. And then, just when the night seems at its calmest, when the air is still and the house feels almost peaceful, a scream tears through the silence, a sound so horrifying, so tortured, that it chills the very marrow in your bones. But it's not a scream from the living. It's the sound of something far worse, the scream of a soul trapped in the house, a soul that cannot escape, that cannot find peace. The scream fades, but the feeling remains, hanging in the air like a thick fog. And with it comes a chilling realization: no one leaves the house. The house is alive, ancient, feeding on the fear, the suffering of those who wander into its grasp. Once you've entered, once you've felt the touch of its cold breath, you are never truly free. The walls, the shadows, the voices, they never stop. They never let go. They keep you, bind you, and claim you as part of its twisted collection of souls, forevermore. As the mist outside thickens, the faintest of footsteps can be heard approaching once more from within the house. But this time, the door doesn't open. No, this time, the door remains closed. Locked. And somewhere, deep within the house, a low voice whispers one last warning, echoing through the darkness. You shouldn't have come. In the heart of old San Diego stands a mansion that seems to watch over the city with an unsettling gaze, a house as beautiful as it is cursed. Known for its imposing structure and classic Victorian elegance, the Whaley House has been lauded as a historic gem. Built in 1857 by Thomas Whaley, a businessman with grand ambitions, the house quickly gained notoriety not for its charm but for the darkness woven into its foundation. While passers-by may see only its polished windows and ivy-laden walls, those who know the mansion's history understand that its beauty masks a legacy marred by tragedy, death, and something far more sinister. The house's corridors have borne witness to unspeakable suffering. Suicides, untimely deaths, executions, and heartache. These are the imprints of the Whaley family and the strangers whose paths were twisted into this house's cursed history. Local legends say that Thomas Whaley himself was haunted by more than ambition when he moved his family into the home. He had chosen to build it on a site that once served as the town gallows, a decision whispered to be the root of the building's eternal misfortune. Shadows of the past, the spirits of the condemned, are said to have lingered in the very soil the house was built upon, waiting for the chance to manifest once more. During the day, the Whaley house wears its history gracefully, almost warmly. Bathed in golden sunlight, it appears to be an ordinary historic building, nestled unassumingly among San Diego's more modern attractions. Yet even in daylight, visitors report strange sensations: a draft that cuts through the warm Californian air, a faint smell of burnt tobacco that never dissipates, a shadow that seems to flicker just out of sight. Some say they've felt icy hands brush against their backs or heard faint footsteps trailing behind them in empty rooms. But as October deepens, the house grows restless. Dusk wraps it in shadows, and the sense of foreboding intensifies. The locals know that the Whaley house is at its most alive as Halloween nears. Those brave enough to enter during this time feel an undeniable tension, as though the walls are holding their breath, waiting. Guides whisper to tourists about the hauntings, recounting tales of ghostly faces seen at windows, the wail of a woman in the dead of night, and the chilling presence of Thomas Whaley himself, roaming the halls in spectral form. Every year, thrill-seekers, skeptics, and curious tourists flock to the house, captivated by its infamous reputation. They come seeking a thrill, a brush with the supernatural, or simply a good scare. Some believe the stories are exaggerated, that the house's dark fame is simply a ploy to draw crowds. But tonight's tour group, a handful of eager explorers with nerves of steel, is about to discover just how real the stories are. The guide, a seasoned storyteller well versed in the Whaley house's troubled past, gathers the tour group outside the entrance as night begins to settle. She carries a small lantern, casting a faint glow over her face, making her expression appear both ominous and inviting. Her voice, low and steady, drifts into the darkening sky as she recounts the house's history, the words hovering like a ghostly fog around the group. This house, she says, has held its secrets for over a century and a half. Most who enter leave with only stories, a memory of a chill or a flicker of something they can't explain. But a few, she pauses, letting her gaze sweep across their faces, a few feel compelled to return, haunted by something they saw or felt or couldn't shake. Some swear they never left the house alone. A murmur spreads through the group as the guide unlocks the heavy front door. With a creak that cuts through the night, the door swings open, revealing a dim hallway that seems to stretch endlessly into the depths of the house. Shadows lurk in the corners, pooling like ink on the floor. The atmosphere changes as they step inside. The air is colder, heavier, thick with a silence that feels alive. It's as if the house itself is breathing, waiting, watching. The guide leads them through the narrow corridor, stopping by a portrait of Thomas Whaley himself. His eyes, dark and intense, seem to follow them, his expression one of pride but perhaps something more sinister, too. Thomas was a man of ambition, the guide says softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He wanted more than just a house. He wanted a legacy. But some legacies, she pauses, her eyes meeting theirs, come at a terrible price. The tourists shiver, but not from the cold. There's an unshakable feeling that the walls are alive, that the house is studying each one of them. They proceed, their footsteps muffled against the worn wooden floors, as if they're treading on hallowed ground. A faint, inexplicable aroma wafts through the air, a blend of old wood, decay, and something more unsettling, like burnt cloth or candle wax that's been smothered out. As they enter the parlor, a sudden draft sweeps through, extinguishing the guide's lantern. In the darkness, a figure seems to flicker in the corner, there one moment, gone the next. The tourists exchange uneasy glances, and a nervous laugh escapes from one of them. But it's quickly stifled when they hear the faint sound of laughter, echoing from somewhere deeper in the house. It's childlike, playful, yet tinged with something unearthly, something that sends a chill down their spines. The guide relights her lantern, her hands trembling slightly, but she keeps her voice steady. That, she says with an unsettling calm, was likely one of the Whaley children. Many believe their spirits still roam these halls. Some guests even claim to feel a small hand slip into theirs when no one else is around. Her words hang in the air, wrapping around them, casting a spell of dread. The group falls silent, feeling a creeping sense of unease. They haven't even entered the heart of the house, and already, the walls seem to close in around them. They're trapped in a place where time doesn't flow, where the echoes of lives long past refuse to fade. The Whaley house is no ordinary landmark, it's a portal, a threshold into a world where the dead and the living coexist, where shadows breathe, and where darkness is more than just the absence of light. Tonight, this group will come face to face with the house's secrets. Some may leave with only a chilling story to tell. But others might never leave at all. As the group moves deeper into the house, the guide's voice lowers, almost as if afraid the walls might overhear her words. She gestures toward the staircase, its banister worn smooth by years of use but somehow untouched by time. Her hand hovers just above the spot where, years before, Violet Whaley, a daughter lost in sadness and despair, had taken her own life. Violet was only 22, the guide murmurs. Heartbroken, humiliated, she sought solace in death when life offered none. Some say her spirit still lingers here, caught in a loop of sorrow, waiting for peace she never found. One of the tourists, a woman with wide eyes and a wary look, steps closer to the staircase, almost mesmerized. A chill trickles down her spine, and though she doesn't see anything, she could swear she feels a presence, something unseen but undeniable, something watching her. For a moment, she thinks she catches the faintest hint of lavender, Violet's favorite perfume, according to legend. But there's no time to linger. The guide ushers them forward, into a dimly lit bedroom filled with vintage furniture. A faint impression on the bedspread hints at someone, or something, having recently disturbed it. The guide hesitates before speaking again. Thomas Whaley himself, she says quietly, is said to haunt this room. His love for this house was so deep that death couldn't sever his connection to it. Some visitors claim to see his figure pacing by the window or feel the press of his cold hand on their shoulder as they sleep. A young man in the back snickers, clearly skeptical. But as he turns to leave the room, he freezes, his breath catching. Out of the corner of his eye, he sees the faint outline of a man by the window, a tall figure with piercing eyes and an intense expression. But when he blinks, the figure is gone, leaving only an unsettling emptiness in its place. With each step, the tour feels as though it's entering the very veins of the house, winding deeper into its secrets. In the nursery, a lone rocking chair sways ever so slightly, though there is no draft, no breeze. The guide raises her lantern, casting an eerie glow across the room, and the chair abruptly stops, as if someone or something is watching, daring them to take a step closer. The guide's voice falters as she recounts tales of disembodied footsteps and the cries of children heard echoing through the house. She clears her throat and gathers herself, adding, "Some say the Whaley children still play here, forever young, forever locked within these walls. If you feel a tug on your sleeve or hear a faint giggle, don't be alarmed. They mean no harm, or so we think." A hushed silence falls over the group. The darkness around them feels thicker, as if the house itself is drawing closer, wrapping them in its history, its tragedies, and its ghosts. They're no longer simply tourists, they're guests of the house, each a new thread in its dark tapestry. But tonight, one question lingers in their minds as they walk through the haunted halls, shadows seeming to follow their every move. Will they be allowed to leave? or will the Whaley house claim new stories and new souls to add to its collection? The guide pauses at the base of a grand staircase, her eyes scanning the faces of the group. Before we continue, she murmurs, I must warn you. Those who climb these steps sometimes feel a presence. Some say it's Thomas Whaley himself, others believe it's Yankee Jim, a drifter hanged on this land long before the house was built. He's been known to tug on visitors' clothes, to whisper their names, or simply stand on the landing, watching. She lowers her voice, leaning toward them. If you feel someone behind you, do not turn around. He doesn't like to be acknowledged. A nervous silence falls over the group as they ascend the creaking stairs, one step at a time, their hearts pounding. The higher they go, the thicker the air becomes, each breath carrying an undeniable sense of being watched. One man at the back shivers as he feels a slight tug on his jacket, but he doesn't dare turn around. He keeps his eyes fixed on the staircase, but his mind races with dread, knowing that something or someone is right behind him. They reach the top, entering the nursery, a room that, despite its innocent decor, feels disturbingly wrong. A small crib sits in the corner, a forgotten doll resting inside, its eyes staring vacantly into the room. The wallpaper, once vibrant, is now faded and peeling, as if drained of life by years of restless spirits. The guide's lantern flickers again, casting eerie shadows that seem to move on their own across the walls. Children have often felt an intense sadness here, the guide says. Some believe it's the spirit of little Thomas, the Whaley's youngest, who died at just 18 months old. He's been seen in the crib, or standing by the window, watching those who enter his room. There are even reports of visitors hearing a soft cry, though no child is ever there. As she speaks, a low wail echoes from somewhere down the hall, sending shivers down everyone's spine. It sounds distant, yet unmistakably real, filling the air with an unnatural chill. One woman, visibly shaken, reaches out to grab her friend's arm, her face pale as she listens to the haunting sound. It fades into silence, but the oppressive weight in the room remains, as though the house itself is alive, feeding on their fear. Do you feel that? One of the tourists whispers, his voice barely audible. It's like the room is breathing. The guide nods slowly, her face solemn. Many believe that the Whaley house is more than just haunted. Some say it's a gateway, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead has worn thin. This house has absorbed every sorrow, every untimely death, every broken heart, and it won't let go. They continue down the dark hallway, the sense of dread intensifying with each step. The walls seem to whisper around them, voices just out of reach, fragments of conversations from another time. Every door they pass feels like a portal to another realm, a shadowy past that refuses to rest. As they approach the master bedroom, a faint scent of lavender fills the air, strangely sweet yet oppressive, like flowers laid at a funeral. The guide pauses, looking back at the group with an unreadable expression. This was Anna Whaley's room. She endured much sorrow in this house, loss, betrayal, and a sense of isolation that weighed heavily on her spirit. Some say she never left, that her grief binds her to this place. Guests have reported seeing her standing by the window, her face sad, as if she's waiting for something, or someone. As they step inside, a sudden chill sweeps through the room, and the door creaks closed behind them, as though the house itself has trapped them within its walls. The air grows thick with an oppressive energy, each of them feeling as if they're intruding on something sacred, something that does not wish to be disturbed. One of the tourists, visibly shaken, takes a step back, but the guide's voice stops him. Remember, whatever you feel, whatever you hear, do not react. The spirits here are drawn to fear. They linger, waiting, hoping someone will notice them, perhaps even reach out. And if they do. She lets the sentence hang in the air, the unspoken words far more chilling than anything she could say. The guide's voice dips into a hushed tone as she leads them to the grand staircase, its wooden steps worn smooth by countless feet over the years. Many people report feeling an overwhelming sense of dread on these stairs, she whispers, almost as if afraid of disturbing something unseen. This was where Violet Whaley, Thomas's young daughter, took her last, tragic steps. A shiver runs through the group as they imagine the forlorn figure of Violet, descending the stairs for the last time, her face pale and heartbroken, a revolver hidden in her trembling hands. Despondent over a failed marriage and ostracized by society, she felt there was no other escape. She ended her life in the parlor, and it's said that her sorrow has seeped into the walls, echoing in the very fabric of the house. To this day, visitors claim to feel an oppressive sadness in this part of the home, as though Violet's despair remains, clinging to the air like a dark cloud. The group hesitates, feeling a weight settle over them, pressing down with a sense of gloom that seems almost palpable. Some instinctively reach for the handrail, only to pull back, as if afraid of what they might touch. The stairwell, illuminated by the faint glow of the lantern, appears to stretch upward into darkness. A few members of the group swear they can see something, a shadow at the top of the stairs, a figure that fades as soon as they try to focus on it. They climb in silence, each step carrying them deeper into the house's secrets, each footfall seemingly absorbed by the walls, as though sound itself is unwelcome here. A faint echo of what might have been a child's laugh seems to drift down from above, soft but chilling, vanishing before anyone can comment on it. At the top of the stairs, the guide stops at a small bedroom door, cracked open just enough to reveal the room's shadowy interior. This is where Thomas Whaley himself would often appear, she says, voice barely above a whisper. Visitors have seen him standing in front of the fireplace, his expression hard and watchful, as though still guarding his home. The lantern light flickers, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and one of the tourists feels an unexpected chill prick the back of their neck. A sense of being watched, scrutinized, as though Thomas himself is here, studying the trespassers who dare to wander his halls. The sense of his presence feels so strong, so immediate, that some of the group turn around, half expecting to see him standing right behind them. But the hallway remains empty, silent, save for the low creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. The stillness presses down on them, amplifying every small sound: their breaths, the faint rustle of clothing, the distant ticking of an old clock somewhere deeper in the house. The atmosphere is thick with an unseen presence, something that feels both distant and close, observing from a world beyond the living. With each passing moment, the group realizes they are not alone in the Whaley house. The spirits of the past are not merely lingering there aware. As the group moves from room to room, a thick, unsettling silence cloaks them. The walls seem to hum with a strange energy, one that raises the fine hairs on the back of their necks. Shadows flicker in the corners of their vision, shifting and moving as if alive. The guide's voice is calm but tinged with a subtle urgency, as though she, too, is wary of overstaying her welcome in each room. In one corner of the house, they gather in what was once the family's parlor. The room is still adorned with antique furniture, sofas with ornate wooden arms, a tall grandfather clock that has long since stopped ticking, and a piano draped in dust. The air is thick and stale, but the faint smell of cigar smoke lingers, an inexplicable scent that makes no sense for a place so carefully preserved and untouched. Then, a sudden creak breaks the silence, coming from somewhere just behind them. The group turns in unison, eyes scanning the room, but they see nothing. One of the tourists, visibly shaken, lets out a nervous laugh. Old houses make noises, right? The guide says nothing, her expression unreadable as she watches the guests with an intensity they can't quite place. After a moment, she gestures toward the adjacent room. This was once the courthouse, she explains, leading them into a dimly lit space where long wooden benches sit in neat rows facing a judge's platform. She explains how the house once served as the city's first official courtroom, a place where sentences were handed down and fates sealed. And then, without warning, the faint echo of footsteps resonates down the corridor they just came from. Slow, deliberate, each step seeming to draw closer. One by one, the group turns toward the sound, eyes wide. Is someone else in here? Someone whispers, glancing at the guide. The guide's face is unreadable, but she says quietly, some believe these footsteps belong to a man who was sentenced to hang. His spirit is said to roam these halls, perhaps still seeking justice or revenge. Others claim he never left because he's waiting for someone to listen to his story. The footsteps grow louder, as if approaching the very doorway where they stand. The guide holds up her lantern, casting the beam down the shadowed hallway, but nothing is there. Just an empty corridor stretching out before them, the floorboards now silent, mocking their fear. One guest backs away, his face pale, muttering, "This feels too real." The guide presses on, taking them upstairs once more, where she leads them into a small bedroom believed to have belonged to the youngest Whaley child, Thomas Whaley Jr., who tragically died as an infant. The room is simple, with a crib in the corner and a rocking chair beside it. She tells them about the frequent sightings people claim to hear the sounds of a baby crying, faintly but distinctly, as though the lost child is still reaching out from beyond. As she speaks, a soft creaking sound fills the air. They turn toward the rocking chair, which now moves gently back and forth, as though an unseen hand is guiding it. The group stands frozen, captivated by the slow, rhythmic motion. The silence feels suffocating, and the faint creak of the chair grates on their nerves. One of the tourists whispers, is something in here with us?" The guide lowers her voice. Many who visit this room feel a presence. Some claim to feel a tug at their sleeves, a cold brush against their cheeks, as if the little boy never quite grew up, never quite moved on. In that moment, a cold breeze sweeps through the room, carrying with it the faintest sound a baby's wail, distant and haunting, lingering in the air like a sorrowful lullaby. One of the guests gasps, clutching her chest, her eyes wide. Did anyone else hear that?" The others nod, each face etched with fear and disbelief, as the mournful cry fades back into silence, leaving them to wonder whether it was real or some trick of their imagination. But in their hearts, they know. The guide gestures toward the narrow hallway leading to a small, dimly lit room known as the theater. Constructed decades after the house was originally built, the room once hosted intimate performances. But no one who steps foot in it now can ignore the strange coldness that clings to the air. The guide's voice drops to a murmur, barely audible, as she recounts the stories of ghostly figures seen wandering this room after dark. Actors, they say, who came to perform and never truly left. The tourists gather near the doorway, glancing around with unease. The lantern casts long shadows, and one man in the group remarks on the scent of old perfume, floral yet tinged with something bitter, like decay. He turns to the person beside him, asking if they smell it too, but before they can answer, a faint but unmistakable sound drifts through the room, a woman's soft, sorrowful singing. The sound is distant, almost as if it's coming from another room, but it's clear and chillingly real. The group exchanges wide-eyed glances, each face showing a mix of curiosity and fear. The singing is melancholy, laced with heartbreak, and it seems to wrap around them, filling the small space with an aching sorrow. A young woman in the group suddenly gasps, clutching her arm. Did someone just touch me?" she whispers, her voice shaking. She looks around, her face pale, but the others shake their heads. No one was close enough to have brushed against her, yet she insists that she felt a light, icy grip on her wrist, as though someone was trying to pull her further into the room. The guide doesn't smile or offer reassurances, she knows better. Instead, she looks at the young woman with an understanding nod. "Many feel the presence of Anna," she says, referring to a former resident who, according to local lore, spent countless hours alone in this very room. They say she was never able to leave, bound here by a sorrow she could never escape. It's believed that she reaches out, hoping someone will understand her pain. The group falls silent, the air growing heavier with an indescribable sadness, as though Anna's spirit has settled around them. One of the tourists, visibly unsettled, glances back toward the door. "Maybe we should go back," he murmurs, his voice barely above a whisper. But before anyone can move, a sudden, sharp bang echoes through the room, the sound of something heavy falling or perhaps slamming shut. The group jumps, some of them letting out startled cries. The guide raises her lantern, casting a shaky light toward the source of the noise, but there's nothing there, only the empty shadows that seem to be closing in on them. The silence that follows is deafening, punctuated only by the rapid breathing of the tourists and the faint hum of something unseen. One of the more skeptical tourists tries to laugh it off, but the sound is forced, hollow. "It's probably just an old house settling," he says, though his eyes dart nervously to the shadowed corners of the room. Yet even he can't deny the unease creeping over him, the feeling that they're being watched, weighed, and perhaps warned. The guide doesn't linger. She gestures for the group to follow her as she moves toward the exit. But as they leave the theater, the guide catches a glimpse of something in the corner of her eye, a faint, pale figure standing at the back of the room, watching them leave with an expression that is equal parts sorrow and resentment. As they continue their journey through the house, the sensation of being followed intensifies. Shadows seem to shift with each step, dark shapes sliding along the walls as though something is moving just out of sight. The creak of the floorboards echoes their own footsteps, yet they can't shake the feeling that someone or something is walking alongside them, lurking just beyond the edges of the light. In the dining room, a chill fills the air, so cold that their breath comes out in faint clouds despite the warm autumn night outside. The guide pauses by the long, mahogany table, her face drawn as she tells them about the strange occurrences reported here. Chairs found mysteriously rearranged, the faint clinking of cutlery, and on rare occasions, a figure seated at the head of the table, as if waiting for dinner to begin. The tourists glance uneasily at the empty chairs, half expecting to see someone seated there. The room seems to exude a tense silence, as though the walls themselves are holding back whispers of past gatherings, the echoes of lives long extinguished. One of the tourists leans closer to the table, drawn by a morbid curiosity. But as he peers at the polished wood, his breath catches there, in the faint layer of dust, is the unmistakable outline of a handprint, fresh and much smaller than his own. As the tour continues, the tension grows heavier, clinging to each person like a cold mist. The group enters the parlor, the very room where Violet took her life. The air here feels thicker, almost stagnant, and the walls seem to pulse with a sadness that permeates every inch of the room. The guide says nothing, only glancing solemnly at the spot by the window where Violet fell. Suddenly, the lights flicker, plunging the room into darkness. A few gasps break the silence, and someone fumbles for their phone flashlight, illuminating the room with a dim, shaky beam. In the shifting light, one of the tourists catches a glimpse of something near the far corner, a woman's faint outline, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her head bowed, her form barely visible against the shadows. But as soon as they focus, the figure dissolves into darkness, leaving nothing but the echo of a presence that feels both sorrowful and watching. A nervous laugh from someone quickly fades as the silence of the house seems to swallow the sound. The guide speaks, her voice barely audible over the quiet, explaining that visitors often report seeing Violet in this very room, her spirit endlessly reliving the grief that led her to that final moment. She glances toward the window, as though expecting to see the figure herself. The guide moves them along, leading the group to the small, dimly lit courtroom near the back of the house. It's an unusual sight, a courtroom inside a home, but Thomas Whaley had once served as San Diego's legal figure, holding court sessions within his own walls. The old benches creak as the tourists sit, and the guide shares tales of unruly defendants who once sat here, facing Thomas's judgment. This room, she says, is often where people feel the heaviest sense of unease. Some say it's because of Thomas's strict hand with the law, or perhaps the way justice was dispensed without mercy. The faint smell of tobacco wafts through the room, a scent that has no earthly source in the house. The guide explains that visitors occasionally report smelling it, along with the sound of footsteps pacing across the creaky wooden floor, even when no one else is in the room. It's said to be Thomas's spirit, still patrolling his domain, a reminder that the house is, even now, under his watchful eye. A sudden, echoing creak makes everyone freeze, hearts racing, as the footsteps seem to materialize, heavy and deliberate, crossing the floor from the back of the room toward the tour group. One by one, heads turn toward the sound, straining to see any sign of movement in the dim light, but there is nothing, no figure, only the steady, chilling rhythm of footsteps that seem to pass right through them, as though an invisible figure is making its presence known. The guide's face is pale as she tries to keep her composure. Sometimes, she says softly, those who linger too long feel an urge to leave, almost like something, or someone, wants them gone. The footsteps cease abruptly, and the silence that follows feels unnaturally thick. A few of the tourists exchange uneasy glances, some clutching their belongings, wondering if the guide's words are a warning they should heed. But before they can dwell on it, a sudden, sharp sound echoes from the hallway, a distant door slamming shut. The group collectively tenses, listening as the sound reverberates through the house, each person feeling an inexplicable urge to look over their shoulder. The guide ushers them onward, her voice tense, almost urgent, as though eager to get them out of the courtroom, away from the chilling echoes that seem to be drawing closer. As the group inches forward, the air grows heavier, as though the very atmosphere has thickened, making it harder to breathe. The guide pauses at the threshold of a door that leads into the parlor, her lantern casting a dim glow across the room. The flickering light dances on the walls, but it does little to dispel the overwhelming sense of unease. There's something strange about this room, the guide says, her voice trembling slightly as she steps inside, her feet barely making a sound on the wooden floors. People often report hearing whispers, hear voices that aren't their own, murmuring in the darkness. But the whispers, they don't always sound human. The air in the parlor feels wrong, as though it's charged with an energy that doesn't belong. The group stands just inside the door, hesitant, as though crossing the threshold would invite something malevolent into their midst. A soft thud echoes from somewhere deep within the room, causing several of them to jump. It sounds like something or someone moving in the darkness, yet there's no visible source. "Did you hear that?" one of the tourists whispers, their voice tied with fear. Another nods, their hand instinctively reaching out to grip the sleeve of the person next to them. "It came from over there," they add, pointing toward a dimly lit corner of the room where shadows seem to curl and shift on their own. But when they look again, the space is empty, silent. The guide turns to face them, her expression somber. "You might not believe it now, but I assure you this house remembers. It remembers everything. The joy, the sorrow, the pain. The lost souls who still wander these halls. And when you enter, it watches." The group exchanges uneasy glances, the weight of her words sinking in. Some are still trying to convince themselves that it's all a trick, an elaborate performance, or perhaps just their imaginations running wild in the dark. But there's something about this place, something ancient and oppressive, that makes it hard to deny the truth. The Whaley house is alive with the memories of its past, memories that refuse to stay buried. A sudden gust of wind rattles the windows, and the door behind them slams shut with a force that echoes through the house. The sound is deafening, causing several members of the group to jump back in alarm. The guide's lantern flickers once, twice, and then steadies itself, but the room is plunged into an unsettling silence. The temperature has dropped significantly, cold enough that their breaths come out in visible puffs, but the chill doesn't feel like the simple bite of a draft. It feels colder, as though the very walls are exhaling ice. Without warning, the soft sound of footsteps echoes from upstairs. Slow, deliberate steps that reverberate down the hall, followed by a creaking sound, like someone shifting their weight on the stairs. It's impossible to tell whether the footsteps belong to one of the tourists or if it's something else entirely. But there's no one else in the house. The guide's face has gone pale, her lips pressed tightly together as she grips her lantern a little tighter. "Stay close," she whispers urgently, as though speaking any louder would provoke whatever presence lingers here. "We can't stay here for too long. The house doesn't like it." The group, now visibly shaken, huddles together as they move further into the parlor. But the sensation of being watched only intensifies. It feels as though unseen eyes are on them from every corner, every shadow. They try to ignore the voices in the distance, the shifting sounds in the walls, but the air is thick with something they can't explain, something ancient, something that's been waiting for them to acknowledge it. Another gust of wind blows through the room, colder this time, and the group hears a faint, almost imperceptible whisper that seems to come from nowhere. It's not in their heads. They all hear it, soft, guttural, a voice that echoes from the depths of the house. "Leave." The guide's eyes widen in alarm, and she immediately moves to usher the group back toward the entrance. "We need to go now," she urges, but it's too late. The door to the hallway has slammed shut, trapping them inside. The temperature plunges further, and now there's a palpable feeling of something moving in the darkness, just beyond their sight. A shadow darts across the far corner of the room, but when they turn to look, it's gone. Only the cold remains, seeping into their bones, and the terrifying sense that the house is coming alive, its ghost stirring, reaching out to claim them. One of the tourists screams, her voice high-pitched and desperate, and that's when they hear it, the unmistakable sound of a woman crying. It's faint at first, a soft sobbing that seems to come from behind the walls. Then, as they strain to listen, it grows louder, more frantic. The cry of a woman in agony. The guide, pale and shaking, steps backward, her hand trembling as she reaches for the door handle. "Violet," she breathes, her voice tight with terror. "She's here. She never left." The guide motions toward a narrow door at the far end of the hallway, where the shadows seem to grow thicker, darker, as if they have a life of their own. She pauses before opening it, her hand lingering on the doorknob. The lantern's light wavers again, casting strange, twisting shapes on the walls that don't seem to belong. "Behind this door," she says softly, "lies one of the most infamous parts of the Whaley house, the courtroom." The group stares at her, unsure of what to expect. The word courtroom sounds strange here, in the middle of a house filled with personal tragedy. She opens the door slowly, and a heavy, musty air rushes out, mingling with the cold draft that has followed them through the house. The room is small, but as they step inside, the weight of history presses in on them. Faint marks from long-forgotten trials seem to linger in the air, and the room feels unnervingly confined, as though the walls are closing in. As the group begins to settle, a sudden, sharp sound cracks the silence, the unmistakable sound of something moving across the floor. A woman in the group gasps, looking wildly around. "Did you hear that?" But there's nothing. Only the faint creak of the old house settling. The guide's face tightens slightly, as though this isn't the first time this has happened. She takes a deliberate step forward, leading the group deeper into the room, and as they follow, the temperature drops further. It's so cold now that they can see their breath in the air, hanging like mist. Then, one of the tourists, a man in his mid-30s, suddenly freezes. His face goes pale, and he reaches for his friend's arm, his eyes wide with fear. "There's someone behind me," he whispers, his voice barely audible. Everyone turns, but the room is empty. Only the shadows seem to shift, deeper now, as though something is moving just beyond the edge of sight. The guide doesn't miss the change in the group's demeanor. She moves forward with an almost imperceptible haste, her lantern shaking slightly as she leads them toward the back of the room. "This room," she continues, her voice low, "is said to be where the spirit of Yankee Jim resides." At the mention of the infamous ghost, the group falls silent. Yankee Jim, a man who was hanged for stealing a boat in 1852, was one of the many spirits believed to haunt the Whaley house. His execution was carried out on the grounds where the house now stands, and his restless spirit is said to never leave. In fact, some claim to feel his heavy presence the moment they step into this room, a weight that presses down on their chest, making it hard to breathe. The temperature drops again, and the group's breath fogs in the air. But this time, they don't have time to comment. A loud thud sounds from behind them, a noise so sudden that it startles them all. It comes from the direction of the doorway. Someone gasps, and in the dim glow of the lantern, they can just make out the shape of something or someone standing in the hallway, just outside the door. A tall figure, draped in shadow, its features obscured. The group's eyes widen as they instinctively step back, but the figure remains still, unblinking. The guide's voice drops even lower, a tremor in her tone. "That," she says quietly, "is the one you don't want to meet." The air grows colder still, as though the house itself is holding its breath. No one dares to move, but their feet seem rooted to the floor, as though the very ground beneath them is pulling them toward that dark, indistinct figure in the doorway. A sudden gust of wind blows through the open window, slamming the door shut with a deafening bang. The lantern flickers wildly, casting long, twisting shadows across the room. And then, as suddenly as it appeared, the figure is gone. Everyone is frozen. No one speaks, no one moves. The silence that follows is thick and heavy, suffocating. The guide slowly turns, her face pale, her eyes wide with the understanding that something has just crossed the threshold of the living and the dead. It's clear now this is not just a tour, not just a visit to a haunted house. The Whaley house has claimed their presence, and its ghosts are more than willing to make their own introductions. "Don't be fooled," the guide whispers, as she leads them toward the door. "This house, it doesn't let go. And once you're inside, it always knows where you are." The guide continues, her voice trembling just slightly, "It's not just Thomas or Violet who haunt this house. It's the souls of others who met violent, untimely ends." Her words settle over them like a shroud, heavy and cold. Visitors have reported hearing footsteps that aren't their own, voices that seem to come from nowhere, and figures that slip out of view just as you're about to speak to them. As if on cue, a faint thud echoes from the far end of the hall, too soft to be a real footstep, too deliberate to be a mere creak of the house settling. The group halts in their tracks, eyes darting nervously toward the darkened doorway at the far end. The faint outline of a figure seems to materialize in the shadows, its shape too blurry to be certain of, but unmistakably human. One of the tourists gasps, grabbing the arm of the person standing next to them. "Did you see that?" they whisper urgently. But when the others turn to look, the shadow is gone, vanishing into the darkness with an unnatural swiftness. The air seems to grow heavier, suffocating, as if the walls themselves are closing in around them. The guide doesn't flinch, she has seen it all before. But she knows that tonight is different. There is something about the way the house seems to be stirring, something restless in the air, as if the spirits are more eager to make their presence known than usual. "You're not imagining things," the guide says, her voice low but reassuring. "There's a reason this house is considered one of the most haunted in America. It's not just the stories, there's real power here. And it's watching you." The group shifts uneasily, as the guide leads them deeper into the heart of the house. As they pass through the grand parlor, the temperature drops sharply. Their breath becomes visible in the air, and the flickering light of the lantern seems to grow dimmer, as if the darkness itself is encroaching. The silence is absolute, except for the steady ticking of the old grandfather clock, a sound that now feels oppressive, as though time itself is slowing down. Then, suddenly, a loud crash from upstairs shatters the stillness. The group jumps, hearts racing, as the sound of shuffling footsteps follows a heavy dragging sound, like someone or something struggling to move. It comes from the room at the end of the hall, a room where no one has entered for years, its door sealed shut for safety. The guide doesn't flinch at the noise. She steps forward, and the group hesitates. They all want to stay, to see what happens next, but a primal fear holds them back. It's as though the house is daring them to move forward, testing their courage, or perhaps luring them towards something far darker. The Whaley house has a reputation for pulling people in, the guide says, turning to face them. Once you're here, the house has a way of keeping you. You'll find yourself coming back again and again, even if you don't want to. A flicker of light suddenly bursts from upstairs, casting an unnatural glow over the walls, and a chill runs through the air like an electric jolt. Then, without warning, the lights flicker out entirely. In the pitch-black darkness, the group stands frozen. The sound of breathing, rapid and shallow, fills the silence, except it's not just their own breathing they hear. There's something else, something nearby, something watching them from just beyond their sight. Then, a voice, a whisper so faint it could almost be mistaken for the wind, drifts down from the darkness above. "Help me." The words are chilling, barely audible, but unmistakably clear. The guide's face goes pale, her grip tightening on the lantern, and for the first time, she looks uncertain. She doesn't speak, but her eyes flicker nervously toward the staircase, where the shadows seem to swirl, as though something is coming down, something not quite human, but something that remembers what happened here. "Stay close," she mutters under her breath, leading the group toward the staircase, where the air is thick with dread. The temperature drops even further, until their skin feels icy, their breath clouding in front of their faces. The lantern's light flickers weakly, casting long, distorted shadows that seem to stretch unnaturally across the walls. Each step they take seems to echo louder, the sound amplified by the silence that envelopes them. And with every step closer to the top of the stairs, the oppressive feeling grows. It's as though something is watching them, studying them, waiting for the moment when they can no longer turn back. It's as if the house is holding its breath, ready to unleash whatever it has kept hidden for so many years. But when they reach the top, the noise stops. The whispering fades, and the darkness becomes still. No footsteps. No voices. Just an unsettling silence, like the calm before the storm. The guide hesitates before pushing open the door to the room at the end of the hall. The hinges creak loudly in the silence, the sound seeming to echo across the empty house. And as the door opens, a cold breeze sweeps out, carrying with it the scent of decay. Inside, the room is pitch black, the shadows inky and deep. But something moves, just a flicker of movement at the far corner. The lantern's light shakes as the guide steps back, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, the group thinks they've seen something, someone standing there, just out of sight. A soft voice whispers, "You're not supposed to be here." And then, everything goes completely still. As the group moves deeper into the house, the air seems to grow colder with each passing second. The faint smell of old tobacco lingers, a reminder of the Whaley family's dark history, and the creak of the floorboards beneath their feet becomes the only sound in the suffocating silence. The house seems to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen, waiting for them to make the next move. The guide leads them into the parlor, where the furnishings, though antique, still hold a sense of macabre elegance. But it's not the furniture that draws their attention, it's the oppressive presence that fills the room. The temperature drops further, and the faint smell of decay and burnt candle wax fills the air. The room feels alive with something unseen, something that has been waiting for them. And then, there's the sound. At first, it's barely noticeable, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on a table. But as it grows louder, it becomes clear, the sound is coming from the corner of the room. The group turns, their eyes wide, but the corner remains empty. No one dares to move, but the tapping continues, persistent, growing louder, like a heartbeat echoing through the room. "Did you hear that?" one of the tourists whispers, their voice shaking. But no one responds. Everyone is too afraid to speak, Too afraid to move, afraid that if they acknowledge it, the tapping might stop or worse, it might intensify. The guide, her face pale in the lantern light, steps forward slowly. The house has a way of revealing its presence, she says, her voice strained but calm. Sometimes it's a whisper, sometimes a tap, sometimes something far worse. But you must never ignore it. Suddenly, the tapping stops. An eerie silence settles over the group. The tension is unbearable, and for a moment, no one dares to breathe. The lantern flickers, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. The house is waiting. But for what? Then, a cold gust of wind blows through the room, snuffing out the lantern completely. The darkness is suffocating, a thick, velvet black void that seems to close in on them from all sides. A collective gasp rises from the group, and panic begins to stir in their chests. Stay calm, the guide says, her voice barely audible in the pitch-black room. Stay close. The house can play tricks, but we are not alone. We are never alone here. Just as the words leave her mouth, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoes through the room. Slow. Measured. Heavy. A shadow crosses the doorway, but it isn't human. No one dares to look, but the sensation of being watched grows, as if something is standing just beyond the reach of the lantern's faint light, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The footsteps stop, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, the house falls into complete silence. Then, a low, guttural whisper seems to rise from the floorboards themselves. It's unintelligible at first, but then it becomes clear. Leave. The word hangs in the air like a curse, the chill of it seeping deep into their bones. The group stirs, but no one moves. The tension is thick, suffocating. Their breaths are shallow, their hearts pounding in their chests. The house feels alive now, almost predatory in its silence, as if it has been waiting for this very moment. And then, just as quickly as the whisper came, it's gone. The lantern flickers back to life, casting a pale, ghostly light over the room. But the atmosphere has changed. The air feels heavier, colder, more oppressive. Something has shifted in the house, something malevolent, something ancient. The group looks around, but the space feels somehow smaller, as if the walls have inched closer together, trapping them within the house's grasp. The guide, though visibly shaken, steps forward, her voice trembling. This is the heart of the house, she says. This is where it all started. The spirits that linger here, they're not just stories. They're real. She pauses, her eyes scanning the room, as if searching for something just beyond the light. But you have to understand something, she continues, her voice barely above a whisper. Once the Whaley house has your attention, it doesn't let go. The group exchanges nervous glances. The house is still. The shadows are still. But something feels off. The presence is stronger now, thicker in the air, like a weight pressing down on their shoulders. And as they stand there, frozen in place, they can't help but wonder, are they here to simply learn about the hauntings of the past? Or have they become part of the story, trapped in the house's never-ending cycle, where the dead never truly leave? The guide slowly reaches for the door, but as her hand touches the handle, the unmistakable sound of a door creaking open echoes through the house, coming from somewhere else, deep within its walls. The air goes cold again, and for a second, the group's breath catches in their throats. Something or someone is waiting. As the group steps further into the heart of the house, the air grows heavier, colder, as if the very walls themselves are pressing in around them. Their footsteps seem unnaturally loud in the silence, each one reverberating through the house like an unwelcome intrusion. The guide pauses, her eyes scanning the room ahead of them, but the light from the lantern dances in unsettling ways, casting long, erratic shadows that seem to have a life of their own. It's here, in this room, where the most unusual things happen, she says, her voice trembling ever so slightly. The group follows her gaze to the far corner of the room, where an old rocking chair sits alone, its worn frame creaking softly, as if disturbed by an unseen force. The chair has a history, the guide explains, a legacy of paranormal activity that has been documented time and time again. Visitors have reported seeing the chair rock slowly on its own, even when there's no breeze to push it. Some have even claimed to feel something or someone sitting beside them, a cold presence that sends a shiver through their spine. As if on cue, the chair creaks again, the sound so distinct that one of the tourists gasps. The others glance nervously at each other, their eyes darting from the rocking chair to the dark corners of the room. The temperature seems to drop another few degrees, making the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. Suddenly, a faint whisper floats through the air, so soft that it could easily be mistaken for the wind or a trick of the mind. But there's no wind. The windows are shut, the air still. The whisper is followed by a sudden sharp noise like a quiet thud, as if something or someone has dropped to the floor. A few of the tourists freeze, holding their breath, eyes wide as they look around. "What was that?" one of them asks, but the guide remains motionless, her eyes narrowed as if she's listening to something beyond the hearing of the group. For a moment, there's silence, thick and unnerving. Then, another sound. A faint shuffle, barely audible at first, but growing steadily louder. It sounds like footsteps, soft and slow, pacing just out of sight, moving down the hallway from behind them. One of the tourists slowly turns, their eyes widening as they stare into the darkened corridor. But there's nothing there. No one. Only the lingering scent of something old, moss, decay, and the faintest trace of something burned. The group begins to feel the growing weight of the house pressing in on them. Some of them begin to fidget nervously, others clutching at their jackets as if to ward off the cold that isn't there. The air is thick now, unnaturally so, as though they are breathing in something heavier than just dust and age. Their senses are heightened, every little sound amplified, every shadow more menacing than the last. And then it happens, an unmistakable creak from the floorboards above them, followed by the distinct sound of something or someone moving across the ceiling. It's deliberate, slow, and purposeful. The footsteps are heavy, as though the person up there is walking slowly, one footfall after another, testing the strength of the beams above them. The guide's lantern flickers once more, casting long shadows over the walls, as she speaks, her voice lower now, almost hypnotic in its calmness. Many have heard it's someone walking above them when there's no one there. Some believe it's Thomas Whaley himself, forever pacing the halls of his home, trapped in a never-ending loop of regret. The group stares up at the ceiling, their eyes wide with disbelief, as the sound continues, moving with purpose and intent. It's not just an odd creak, it's the sound of footsteps, deliberate and measured, as if someone is slowly circling them, sizing them up. One tourist, unable to resist any longer, steps forward and calls out, "Who's up there?" His voice cracks slightly, but there is no response, only the soft creak of the floorboards as the steps stop suddenly. The air shifts again. The temperature drops even further, so cold that the breath of the group is visible in the dim light of the lantern. A strange, static-like hum fills the air, an eerie sound that seems to vibrate through their bones. It's not wind. It's not the house settling. This is something else, something unnatural. And then, just as quickly as it started, the sound ceases. The house grows eerily still, as though holding its breath. The group stands frozen in the silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. They don't dare move, don't dare speak. Something has shifted in the house, something unseen, something waiting. "Keep close," the guide finally whispers, her voice just a little too strained. The house is listening. And it's watching. The group feels the oppressive weight of her words. The very walls of the house seem to close in, the air thick with an almost tangible presence. But there's no escape, not now. No one will leave this house unchanged. Something in the dark is waiting for them to make the next move. Something old, something angry. The house has seen many things in its time. And it hasn't forgotten. As the group continues to stand at the threshold of the bedroom, the temperature in the air drops even further. A coldness that feels like it seeps into the bones, numbing the skin and causing each breath to form a visible mist. The guide's voice trembles, but she presses on, leading them deeper into the house's haunted heart. "This is where things get truly unsettling," she says quietly, her eyes darting toward the closed door. "The spirits here don't just linger. They act. They interact. Many people who've stayed here have claimed to feel an icy hand graze their shoulders, or hear whispers in the dead of night, murmuring things that don't make sense." She pauses, glancing back at the group, ensuring their attention is fixed on her words. "But some have had worse encounters, things that can't be explained by the living." One of the tourists steps forward, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean by that?" he asks, his voice betraying the nervousness he can no longer hide. The guide's gaze sharpens, and for the first time, she looks genuinely disturbed. She hesitates for a moment, as if contemplating whether to share the darker side of the house's history, before nodding. "There have been reports of people being physically touched by invisible hands, dragged, even. Some say they've heard footsteps following them when no one was there." Just as she finishes speaking, a loud thud echoes from somewhere deeper in the house, startling everyone. The sound is unmistakable, like something heavy hitting the floor, followed by a faint scraping noise. A moment of stunned silence hangs in the air, thick with tension, before the guide exhales, her breath shaking. "It's nothing," she says quickly, but her eyes flicker toward the source of the noise. "Old house. Sometimes the floorboards just creak on their own." The house settles. But the uncertainty in her voice only adds to the rising anxiety in the group. The sudden noise has shattered the fragile illusion of safety, and now every sound, every shift in the air feels magnified. One of the tourists, a young woman, suddenly gasps and steps back, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispers, her voice tied with fear. I swear I felt something." The others exchange nervous glances, and the guide stiffens, turning slowly toward the narrow hallway that stretches in front of them. For a brief second, a shadow seems to dart past the doorway, just beyond the lantern's flickering light. It's a blur, a figure, too fast to make out, but the presence is unmistakable. Everyone freezes. The air becomes even colder, so cold it stings. Their breaths are visible now, swirling in the dim light like tiny clouds of ice. The lantern's flickering flame casts strange, elongated shadows along the walls. The sound of soft footsteps echoes from upstairs, slow and deliberate. And then silence. A silence that feels too heavy. The kind that presses against the eardrums, suffocating. For a long moment, no one moves, the unease growing, settling like a weight on their chests. The guide's voice is barely audible when she speaks, her words tied with fear. "We're not alone here. I've told you about the spirits, but there's something more, something angry. It wants us to know it's here." The sound of footsteps resumes, closer now. It's unmistakable, heavy, deliberate steps that echo down the hallway toward them, but no one is visible. The guide's hand shakes as she holds the lantern, her face drained of color. The group stands motionless, unable to tear their eyes away from the darkness ahead, waiting for whatever is coming. And then, in the distance, a door slams shut with a deafening bang louder than anything they've heard so far. It shakes the entire house. The sound reverberates in their bones, as though the very foundations of the Whaley house are protesting their presence. For a moment, there is no sound. No movement. And then, from the farthest room, a voice, quiet, faint, but unmistakable, calls out to them. A soft, mournful whisper, almost like a breath being carried by the wind. "Leave, now." The words are clear enough, and the terror in the group is palpable. The voice is not human. It carries a weight of anguish and frustration, as if begging the intruders to escape, to flee before it's too late. The guide's hand trembles, her lantern now shaking so violently that the light flickers wildly, casting erratic shadows. She looks at the group, her face pale, but her expression unreadable. This is where we end tonight's tour. You need to leave. But as the group turns to leave, the door to the entrance slams shut, trapping them inside. The walls seem to close in, and the temperature plummets, frost creeping along the edges of the windows. Something is moving in the dark. They are no longer just visitors in the Whaley house, they have become guests to the spirits, and they are about to learn what happens to those who linger too long in its haunted halls. The guide steps forward, pushing the door open slightly wider, revealing the room in full. The shadows seem to dance in the corners, stretching and flickering as though trying to escape the light. The air feels colder here, almost unnaturally so, and the tourists pull their jackets tighter around their shoulders. The guide doesn't move into the room, instead, she simply stands in the doorway, her eyes scanning the dim space inside, almost as if expecting something to emerge. Many claim to have seen figures in this room, she continues, her voice now barely a whisper, as though speaking louder might provoke something. Some have even felt a cold hand on their shoulder, only to turn around and find no one there. The group grows quiet, their breaths shallow, as though they too are waiting for something. Time seems to stretch, the seconds dragging on longer than they should. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind feels amplified in the oppressive silence. The air grows thicker, and the group starts to feel the weight of the house's dark history pressing in on them. The spirits don't seem like distant echoes anymore, they feel close. Too close. A sudden sound breaks the stillness. Thump. It's soft at first, barely perceptible, but it's enough to make everyone freeze. It comes from inside the room. The group stiffens, a collective breath held. The guide's face tightens, and her gaze flicks toward the door with a cautious glance. "What was that?" one of the tourists asks, voice trembling slightly. The guide doesn't answer immediately. She just steps aside, allowing the door to creak open just a little more. Thump. Thump. The noise grows louder now, as if something or someone is pacing slowly inside. The sound is unmistakable, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, methodical. But there's no one visible inside the room. Another step. The tourists glance at one another, their eyes wide with unease. A few of them inch forward, drawn by the irresistible pull of the unknown, but none of them dare to cross the threshold. The room remains empty, yet the footsteps continue, echoing in the stillness. Each step seems to reverberate through the walls, filling the space with a sense of anticipation, as if something is waiting for them, something that they can't see but can feel in every fiber of their being. The guide's eyes flick nervously toward the lantern she's holding, her hand trembling slightly. She clears her throat. The spirits here, especially those who met violent ends, are known to manifest in ways that seem real. But they are not always visible. Sometimes, they leave behind only the sounds of their suffering. A sharp gasp escapes one of the tourists, and the group turns to see a woman standing frozen by the door. She points into the room, her finger trembling. "Do you see it?" she whispers, her voice shaking with fear. The others lean forward, straining to see what she's pointing at. At first, it's impossible to make out anything through the darkness. But as their eyes adjust, they notice something unsettling movement in the far corner of the room. At first, it's just a shadow, but it seems to shift, as though something large is moving slowly, deliberately, in the corner. The shape remains indistinct, but it's growing. Thump. A sound that seems to come from inside their very souls. A soft whisper drifts through the air, faint but unmistakable. The group leans in, straining to hear it. "Help me." It's a woman's voice. Faint. desperate. Yet it doesn't come from any living person. The sound seems to reverberate from the walls themselves, as though the house itself is speaking its voice, the echo of a tragedy that refuses to die. A surge of cold air fills the room. The temperature plummets sharply, a frigid gust that cuts through even the thickest layers of clothing. The lantern flickers violently in the guide's hand, threatening to go out. One of the tourists shivers violently, and in the sudden cold, they hear it again, this time closer, clearer. "Help me." The voice is louder now, closer. And the group can't ignore the undeniable sensation creeping over them, the feeling of a presence, something, or someone, right behind them. Whispers fill the air as if multiple voices are converging, all imploring, all pleading. Thump. One final, heavy step. Then, silence. The group is on edge, frozen in place. The air is thick, the house seemingly holding its breath. It feels as though time itself has stopped. The lantern flickers again, and the guide takes a hesitant step back from the door. "It's just a part of the house's charm," she says, but even her voice quivers with the unmistakable edge of fear. The room seems to close in around them, the weight of the past pressing down until it feels unbearable. And then, as if the house itself has decided they've had enough, the lantern goes out completely, plunging them into pitch-black darkness. In the blackness, the footsteps begin again. Closer now. Slower. Thump. 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 And the whispers, oh, the whispers growing louder, more desperate. As the group steps into the room, the weight of the house seems to intensify. The air grows colder, and a silence deeper than before settles around them. The guide doesn't immediately speak, allowing the room to envelop them with its oppressive energy. The walls, lined with old portraits of the Whaley family, seem to shift in the lantern's flickering light, their eyes following each movement. The room is preserved with a disturbing kind of reverence, as if it's frozen in time, locked in a memory that refuses to fade. Then, suddenly, a low, almost imperceptible creak sounds from the far corner of the room. The guide looks over her shoulder, but no one else moves. "Did you hear that?" she asks, her voice barely audible. The group tenses, but no one answers. The creak sounds again, followed by what seems like the soft shuffle of footsteps across the wooden floor. A few of the tourists instinctively draw closer to one another, their hearts pounding in their chests. The guide smiles knowingly, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You're not alone in here," she says softly. "This room, it's where Thomas Whaley's spirit is often seen. It's said that he never truly left. He's still here, watching over the house, guarding its secrets." A hushed murmur spreads through the group. One person asks if anyone has ever seen him, and another quickly responds, "I've heard rumors." People say they've seen his figure in the window, or standing by the fireplace, looking out at the street. But it's always quick, like he's just waiting for something, or someone. The guide nods, her gaze becoming distant as she stares into the dimness of the room. Thomas's presence is often felt when people least expect it. Some hear footsteps behind them, others see flickers of movement in the corner of their eye. But the most unnerving experiences seem to occur when people linger too long in the house, when they stay too close to the memories. She pauses, letting the words sink in. And then, something changes. A sudden draft sweeps through the room, the kind that feels like it's been waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The guide shivers, her lantern flickering, threatening to go out. She steadies it, but the unease has already settled in. "That's when it happens," she says quietly. People start to feel it's something cold, like fingers brushing their skin, or a voice whispering their name from just out of sight. And no one can explain it. They leave, but they never truly leave. Not all of them. A few members of the group glance nervously at the door, their eyes darting between the shadows in the room, but they say nothing. The guide's words hang in the air like a challenge, an invitation to uncover the truth that lies buried beneath the floorboards. "Now, look around you," she instructs, her voice low. "The Whaley house has seen many things. Death, tragedy, betrayal. And as long as it stands, the spirits of those who lived and died here will continue to roam its halls. Some are content to drift in the background, but others, they seek attention." The group falls quiet, the only sound the soft, steady ticking of the clock in the corner. The air feels heavier now, charged with something unspoken. The flicker of the lantern grows more erratic, casting long, grotesque shadows across the walls. Someone whispers, but it's hard to tell where the voice is coming from. It doesn't feel like it belongs to anyone in the group. And then, it happens. A cold breath brushes the back of one of the tourists, so cold it sends a shiver straight down their spine. They spin around, but there's no one there. No one who could have touched them. The others feel it too, a cold presence, something unseen yet undeniably there. One woman in the group gasps, her face paling as she clutches the sleeve of the person standing next to her. "Did you feel that?" she whispers. Before anyone can answer, another noise breaks the stillness. A soft knock. 3 distinct, purposeful taps like someone at the door. The guide's eyes widen, the lantern now flickering wildly, casting frantic shadows across the room. She doesn't say a word, but her expression is enough to tell the group, this isn't a typical tour. Something in the house has just stirred. The knocking comes again, louder this time, closer. Each tap echoes through the room with a weight that makes the walls seem to pulse, alive. The group shuffles nervously, eyes flicking from one corner to the next, trying to find the source of the noise, but the room is empty except for them. The guide moves toward the door slowly, hesitantly, and places her hand on the knob. "It's not the house you need to be afraid of," she murmurs, turning the handle. "It's the things inside of it. The things that never left." The door creaks open, and for a brief, horrifying moment, the group believes they can see something standing in the shadows just beyond the threshold. Something tall and dark, its features obscured by the dim light. A figure? Or just their imagination playing tricks on them? Without warning, the temperature drops again, this time so suddenly that their breath becomes visible in the air. The door slams shut with a deafening bang, startling everyone in the room. The guide looks back at them, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "That," she says, her voice now trembling, "is why we're never really alone here. Some things don't just haunt the Whaley house, they own it." The group stands frozen, trapped between the mystery of the past and the chilling realization that the house might be more alive than they ever imagined. The guide's lantern flickers once more, casting a long, wavering shadow down the hallway as she leads the group deeper into the Whaley house. The further they go, the more it feels as though the house itself is reacting to their presence, shifting with them, whispering to them through the creaks of the floorboards and the groans of the walls. The heavy, suffocating silence seems to echo with unspoken words, as though the house itself is holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They reach the parlor where the air is thick with history and with something darker, something that doesn't belong. The guide steps aside to allow the group to gather in the room. It's a modest space, yet undeniably unsettling. The furniture is antique, draped in thick velvet, and the walls are lined with portraits of the Whaley family, their eyes fixed on the visitors in a way that feels too deliberate, too knowing. The air is still, but there's something faintly disturbing about it, as though time itself had frozen in this room, its very existence suspended in a moment of grief. "This is where Violet Whaley took her life," the guide begins, her voice somber, but there's a slight tremor underneath it, as if even she feels the weight of the room. She couldn't bear the pain of her broken marriage, her falling social status, and the pressure of her family's expectations. Her father, Thomas, tried everything he could to save her, but in the end, the sorrow was too much. She took her life here, and ever since, Her presence has been felt. As the group listens, there's a palpable shift in the room. Some of them feel it more than others, a sudden heaviness in the air, as though something unseen is pressing down on their chest. One of the tourists, a young woman, steps closer to the fireplace. Her eyes widen as she stares into the flames, as though entranced by the flickering light. "Do you feel that?" she whispers, her voice trembling. The others turn to her, puzzled, but her expression is one of pure concentration, as though something unseen has gripped her attention. The guide notices the change, her gaze hardening slightly. "What do you feel?" she asks, stepping closer. There's a slight edge to her voice now, a sharpness that wasn't there before. It's as if she, too, senses that something is changing in the air, that something is about to unfold. The young woman's eyes flicker, darting between the portraits on the wall. "It's like, someone's watching me. I can feel it, right here." She places her hand on her chest, just above her heart, as though trying to ward off an invisible pressure. The room falls silent as they all turn to look at her. The temperature drops a few degrees, sending a chill through the group. The flickering light of the lantern casts ghostly shadows across the walls, elongating the features of the portraits. For a moment, it feels as though the eyes of the Whaley family are following their every move, observing them with a knowing gaze. And then, the faintest sound breaks the stillness. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a faint shuffle or whisper, comes from somewhere deeper in the house, from the direction of the staircase. The group freezes, their collective breath caught in their throats. They glance nervously at one another, but no one dares to speak. The guide doesn't flinch. She's heard it before. She's felt the same unsettling presence that now seems to be creeping into the room. Her hand tightens around the lantern's handle, and she takes a slow step forward, her eyes scanning the shadows. "Stay close," she says, her voice low. "Whatever happens next, don't stray. Not even for a second." The group nods nervously, stepping closer together, their eyes wide with unease. The young woman, who had felt the sensation of being watched, now stands still, her eyes wide, her breath quickening. "There's something in the other room," she mutters, her voice shaky, barely audible. The guide nods, but instead of reassuring them, her expression turns graver. "That's the Whaley house. It doesn't just let go of its past. And tonight, it's chosen to remind us of that fact." She pauses, looking directly at the group. "Whatever you've heard about the hauntings here, the ghostly figures, the cold spots, the voices, none of it compares to what some people experience when they come face to face with the spirits that still wander these halls." The air grows heavier as she speaks. The shadows in the room seem to stretch, as though they're moving, growing darker. The temperature drops a few more degrees, and the group starts to feel the true weight of their surroundings. This is no longer just a haunted house, they're standing in the middle of a battlefield, a place where the line between life and death blurs, and where the restless spirits of the past fight to be remembered. "Stay close," the guide repeats, and this time, there's urgency in her voice. "And whatever you do, do not stray. Not even for a second." The room seems to close in around them, the air thick with a growing tension. The group remains huddled together, every single one of them aware that they are not alone in the Whaley house. The ghosts of the past are real, and they are not finished with their visitors yet. The guide's lantern trembles slightly as she steps into the next room, the flickering light casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. She motions for the group to follow her, her voice steady but laced with an undeniable edge. "This," she says, "is where the spirit of the condemned once stood." The room they enter is far colder than the others, the temperature dropping drastically in an instant. Some of the group members instinctively pull their coats tighter, though they know it's not the weather that's chilling them. The room feels wrong, its heavy air pressing down on them like a weight, thick with the presence of something, someone. The guide walks towards the far corner, where an old chair sits in the dim light, facing the fireplace. Many who have come before you report feeling a strange sensation when they sit in this chair, she explains. Some say they felt cold fingers brush their shoulders, or heard the distinct sound of breathing from behind them. But what's most unsettling is the unmistakable voice of a man, whispering from the darkness. At first, the group laughs nervously, but that nervousness quickly fades when a soft, raspy whisper seems to rise from the shadows, filling the room with an uncanny intimacy. "Help me," the words are faint, but they're undeniably clear. The hairs on the back of everyone's neck stand on end, and for a split second, no one dares to move. Then, another whisper, this time from a different corner of the room, "Why did you leave me?" The group stirs uneasily, eyes darting around in search of the source. There's nothing there. No one. Yet the air feels thick with the echoes of voices that should not be heard. The silence that follows is deafening, broken only by the faint thud of a footstep somewhere upstairs. The guide doesn't flinch, her voice steady as she continues, "These whispers are not the result of wind or imagination. They belong to the souls who once lived and died in this house, souls who remain here, their unfinished stories lingering in the air like dust." One of the group members, visibly shaken, whispers, Is that the ghost of Thomas Whaley?" The guide shakes her head, her eyes darkening with a deep, knowing sorrow. "No. Thomas Whaley is not the only one who haunts this house. The spirits of those who suffered here, the innocent and the guilty alike, wander its halls, trapped in an eternal loop of grief, rage, and regret." As she speaks, a sudden, sharp noise cuts through the stillness like the sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. It's coming from upstairs, muffled but unmistakable. The group freezes, holding their breath. The guide raises a hand, signaling for silence. Then the unmistakable sound of a woman's sobs fills the air, soft at first, but growing louder, until it's as though the very walls are weeping. The sobbing is full of anguish, raw and heart-wrenching, like someone who has lost everything, someone who has been waiting for something that will never come. "What's happening?" one of the tourists asks, their voice a mix of fear and disbelief. The guide leads them to the staircase, her steps quick but steady. "Stay close," she warns, her voice trembling just slightly, betraying her own nerves. "What you're hearing is Violet Whaley's sorrow. She is said to haunt this house, wandering the halls, searching for peace she'll never find." As the group ascends the stairs, the sobs intensify, vibrating through the floorboards beneath their feet. The sound of the crying woman feels almost alive, swirling around them, making it hard to tell which direction it's coming from. But just as they reach the top of the stairs, the sobbing stops abruptly. The silence that follows is almost more unsettling than the sound itself. Then, a faint creak. And another. It's coming from the room at the end of the hall. "Violet's room," the guide murmurs. "They say she cannot leave this place, that she is bound to the very walls she once lived within. Every year, when the days shorten and Halloween draws near, she becomes more restless, more insistent, as though trying to tell us something, as though pleading for us to understand her." The group's anxiety spikes as they reach the door. The sobs are gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. The lantern's light flickers once more, casting long shadows that stretch unnaturally down the hallway. Everyone knows they should be prepared for something, but nothing can fully prepare them for what comes next. The door creaks open, the faint scent of stale air and decay rushing toward them as they step inside. And then, standing there in the middle of the room, is a figure. At first, it's just a silhouette, but as their eyes adjust to the dim light, they see her, Violet Whaley, her pale face framed by dark, tangled hair, her eyes hollow with the sorrow of the centuries. She stands motionless, staring at them with an emptiness that chills them to the core. Her hands hang limply at her sides, but there's something in her posture that makes it clear, she has waited for them, waited for this moment to reveal her tragedy, to make them feel what she felt in her final moments. The room grows colder still. A breeze begins to stir, carrying with it the faintest scent of gunpowder, and the heavy air seems to vibrate with the weight of Violet's grief. In that moment, it becomes clear, the Whaley house has not only kept its secrets, it has been waiting for the right people to reveal them. The guide's footsteps echo softly as she moves to the side, allowing the group to take in the eerie bedroom. The air feels denser now, colder, like a fog has crept in unnoticed, and a chill shivers down the spines of the tourists. As they step closer to the doorway, a faint, almost imperceptible sound reaches their ears. Whispers. At first, they think it's just the wind. But then they realize it's more than that, a sound too deliberate, too close. The guide pauses as she catches the expressions of the group. Her eyes widen slightly, as though she's aware of something they don't quite understand yet. "Do you hear that?" she asks, her voice strained, almost hesitant. One of the tourists, a young woman, laughs nervously. "It's probably just the old house settling. You know, creaky floors and stuff." But even her words don't seem to offer any comfort. The whispering grows louder, more distinct. It's as if several voices are speaking in hushed tones just behind the walls, just beyond the reach of the lantern's dim light. The group leans in, straining to hear, but when they try to locate the source, there's nothing, no movement, no one visible. And then, the temperature drops. It's subtle, but unmistakable. A cold breeze sweeps through the hallway, making the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. One man shudders and pulls his jacket tighter around him. The guide's hand tightens around the lantern. "Some say it's Violet," she says softly, her voice tinged with a quiet fear. "She wanders these halls, trapped in her sorrow. And others claim to hear the sounds of her footsteps, echoing at night." A woman at the back of the group gasps. "Did you hear that?" Her voice is shaking. "I thought I heard footsteps." The group falls into a tense silence, eyes darting around the room, half expecting to see a figure in the corner or a movement out of the corner of their eye. But the hallway is still, too still, with only the faint light of the lantern casting long shadows that seem to stretch unnaturally across the walls. Suddenly, there's a loud bang from upstairs, loud enough to make everyone jump. The guide spins around, a look of surprise flashing across her face. The tourists exchange nervous glances, unsure of what to make of the noise. "It's probably just the house settling," the guide says, though the uncertainty in her voice betrays her words. But then, another noise, a low groan, almost like a mournful sigh, comes from deeper within the house. It seems to reverberate through the floorboards, as though it's coming from the very foundations of the house itself. The group stiffens, each person too afraid to speak, too afraid to even breathe too loudly in case they disturb whatever presence is lurking just out of sight. The guide steps back, gesturing toward the narrow hallway that leads to the next room. "There's one more place I want to show you," she says, her voice no longer as confident as it had been. "The parlor. It's where the worst of the tragedies took place." Her words hang in the air, laden with foreboding. As they walk further into the house, the air feels heavier, the silence more pronounced. It's as if the house is holding its breath, waiting for something that hasn't happened in years, but feels inevitable. The group's unease grows, their senses on high alert, each creak and groan of the old house heightening the sense of dread. The parlor looms ahead, its door slightly ajar, just enough to make the shadows inside seem deep and impenetrable. The guide hesitates for a moment, the lantern flickering in her hand. "Some visitors," she whispers, "report hearing the sound of footsteps in this room. The sound of someone pacing, as if they are waiting for something or someone." They step into the room, the temperature dropping even further. The once welcoming space now feels suffocating, as though the weight of countless lost souls is pressing in from every angle. The walls, once adorned with elegant furniture and family portraits, now seem to hold a palpable tension, an unseen presence that hovers in every corner. As they move deeper into the room, the light flickers again, casting long, distorted shadows. And then, just as the last tourist steps into the parlor, the door slams shut behind them with a deafening bang, plunging the group into darkness. The lantern's glow seems to diminish, flickering out completely for a moment, leaving them in an impenetrable blackness. Panic rises in their chests as they hear it, the unmistakable sound of someone, or something, moving in the darkness with them. Footsteps. Slow. Methodical. Almost deliberate. One tourist cries out in fear, their voice trembling in the silence. "What is that? Who's there?" But no answer comes. Only the steady, rhythmic sound of footsteps moving toward them, getting closer. The temperature drops even further, and the sound of a whisper cuts through the air, a voice so soft, it's almost a breath. "Get out." The voice lingers for a moment before disappearing completely, leaving only the hollow, suffocating silence of the house in its wake. And as the lantern light flickers back to life, they see it, the faint outline of a figure, standing at the far corner of the room. No one dares to move. The air is thick with fear. Something is watching them. Something they can't escape. As the group moves deeper into the house, the guide leads them toward a darkened parlor, its windows covered by heavy curtains that allow no moonlight to seep in. The room feels impossibly cold, even though the night outside is warm. A strange buzzing hum fills the air, like the static of a radio station lost to time, its frequency just out of reach. The guide sets down her lantern on the ornate table in the center of the room, and the group gathers around, drawn into the darkness. "This is where it's said the most intense hauntings occur," she murmurs. "Violet's death left an indelible mark here. It's as if her spirit never truly left this space." As she speaks, a faint tapping sound echoes from the walls, a gentle, rhythmic knock that seems to be coming from just behind them. Startled, the group spins around, but no one is there. The room is silent once again. The guide smiles faintly, her lips tight, her eyes betraying a flicker of unease. "Some of you may have felt that," she says softly, as though speaking to the air. "Others might hear it in a moment. It's the way Violet communicates." A small, soft knock, as though asking for attention. The tourists shift uncomfortably. One of them, a skeptic, laughs nervously and shrugs it off. "Just the wind," he mutters, but his voice trembles slightly. Yet, even as he dismisses it, the room seems to grow colder, the temperature dropping several degrees in an instant. The soft tap 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 comes again, this time louder, more insistent. A few of the tourists start to glance around, their faces betraying their unease. No one speaks. Then, without warning, the lantern flickers, casting a momentary shadow on the walls. For a fleeting second, the outline of a figure appears too tall to be human, its silhouette stretching unnaturally as though its form is being distorted by the darkness. It vanishes as quickly as it appeared, but in its wake, the room feels heavier, almost oppressive. The silence that follows is suffocating. "Did you see that?" One of the tourists gasps, her voice barely a whisper. "That shadow." The guide says nothing but simply motions for them to follow her as she moves to the next room. She doesn't need to say much, the house has already begun to reveal its secrets. The group, now visibly shaken, follows her hesitantly, their footsteps tentative as they leave the room behind. But as they move toward the staircase, something happens. An inexplicable sensation grips their chests, tightening their throats. From somewhere within the house, a voice rises, a faint, childlike giggle. It sounds playful, innocent even, yet there's something about it that feels all wrong. It echoes through the halls, bouncing off the walls in an eerie, distorted way. The laughter isn't just in their ears. It's in their heads, ringing in their minds like a mocking lullaby. A few members of the group exchange uneasy glances, but no one speaks. They continue, walking deeper into the house, but every shadow seems to move with them, stretching and pulling as if trying to engulf them. They can't shake the feeling that something is following them, watching them from every corner. They pass the parlor again, and this time, something is different. The door is ajar, just slightly open, but through the gap, they can see something they hadn't noticed before: an old rocking chair, abandoned in the corner. It's moving, ever so slightly, creaking back and forth, as though someone invisible is sitting in it, rocking back and forth in quiet contemplation. The guide stops, her hand resting on the doorframe as she stares at the chair. Her expression hardens. Violet often sits there. She doesn't show herself plainly, but she likes to be near, watching. Another giggle rises, soft and breathy, this time closer than before. It sends chills down the spines of the group, and the room feels like it's closing in on them, as if the walls themselves are aware of their every movement. The guide looks at them, her eyes glinting with the knowledge only time in this haunted house can provide. Some people, she says quietly, leave this house with a piece of it. And that piece, whether it's a sound, a vision, or a feeling, never leaves them. It clings to them. It follows them home. A sharp gasp escapes one of the tourists, her face pale as she looks back over her shoulder. I swear I just felt something brush against my arm. The guide nods. It's not unusual. In fact, it's a sign the spirits here are taking an interest in you. The temperature continues to drop, and as the air grows colder still, a low thud suddenly sounds from above. The group jumps. The guide, with unsettling calm, simply turns and begins to move toward the staircase. Violet's room, she says softly. She's waiting for us. As they ascend the stairs, the giggling grows louder, the presence of the unseen child growing stronger with each step. There's no mistaking it now, the house is alive with the past, its spirits lingering just out of sight, watching, waiting for the living to understand the legacy they've inherited by stepping inside. As the group moves deeper into the house, the eerie quiet of the Whaley house grows suffocating. The temperature drops perceptibly, a cold that settles into their bones, much colder than the autumn evening outside. The sound of their footsteps echoes through the hallways, but there's something unnerving about the rhythm of it, as if there's an extra set of feet following them always just behind. The guide pauses by the parlor door, casting a glance over her shoulder at the group. Her expression is unreadable, her eyes darker than before. This room, she begins, her voice barely above a whisper, was the scene of much of the house's tragedy. It's where Violet took her life, where Thomas and his family endured their greatest losses. But it's also where the house's most intense hauntings have been reported. Not just from the Whaley family, but from those who were unlucky enough to enter, and stay. A slow, deliberate creak emanates from the parlor behind the door, as though something or someone was shifting in the darkness. The guide's eyes narrow slightly, but she doesn't flinch. The group is tense, the silence wrapping itself around them like a living thing. They hold their breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then, it does. A faint, almost imperceptible sound rises from within the parlor, something that sounds like a whisper, but too faint to make out. It's followed by the unmistakable shuffle of feet, dragging along the floorboards. The noise is slow, deliberate, but it doesn't match the pattern of human footsteps. There's an unnatural quality to it, something that feels wrong, a sound that no living person could make. One of the tourists, a man with a skeptical look etched across his face, steps forward, his curiosity pushing him toward the source of the sound. It's just the house settling, he scoffs, attempting to break the tension. But as he moves closer to the parlor door, his words falter, his face turning pale. He freezes mid-step, eyes wide. The rest of the group turns, following his gaze. What they see is nothing at first, just the blackness beyond the door. But then, just on the edge of their vision, a faint movement so quick it's almost imperceptible. A dark figure in the far corner of the room, shifting in and out of view, like smoke slipping between cracks. The man stumbles backward, his heart racing as he backs into the group, knocking over a small table in his haste. The lantern swings wildly, casting dancing shadows along the walls. The guide, still calm despite the chaos, nods toward the door, her voice now firm. That, she says, is not just the house settling. The temperature drops further, and a collective shiver runs through the group. A woman gasps, clutching her chest, her breath visible in the sudden cold. "Did you hear that?" she whispers, but no one answers. The whispers from within the room are growing louder now, unmistakable voices hushed, pleading, and then a sudden scream that cuts through the air like a blade. It's followed by a soft thump, like a body falling to the floor. In the distance, the faint sound of a woman's sobs echoes through the house. But these aren't the cries of an ordinary person, they're filled with such raw, tortured anguish that they make the hair on the back of their necks stand on end. "Don't go in there," someone warns, their voice trembling, but it's too late. The door creaks open on its own, as though the house itself is inviting them to witness the horror that still resides within its walls. The lantern flickers, casting long, spindly shadows that crawl along the floor, stretching toward the group like the hands of the dead. With the door now fully ajar, the group hesitates, unsure of what to do. The air is thick with an oppressive sense of doom. One of the tourists, a young woman with wide eyes, steps forward, her gaze drawn to the room's center. And there, just beyond the threshold, they see it, a shadowy figure standing perfectly still, facing the far wall, as if unaware of their presence. The figure is unmistakably human, but it's too dark to make out any features. It's not until the guide steps forward and raises her lantern higher that they see the gaunt, hollow face of a woman, her eyes wide open but unseeing, as if staring into the void. Her lips are cracked in a silent scream, a soundless echo of the torment she endured. The figure suddenly turns, her body jerking unnaturally, as though propelled by invisible forces. She lets out a guttural moan, a sound so deep and unnatural that it rattles the bones of every person in the room. The group gasps in horror, frozen in place, as the woman begins to slowly walk toward them, her footsteps dragging, each one a tortured scrape across the floorboards. And then, just as suddenly as she appeared, the figure vanishes into thin air, leaving only the faintest scent of burnt tobacco lingering in the air. The room is silent once again, save for the sound of their ragged breathing. No one moves for what feels like an eternity. The door slowly creaks shut, and the guide turns to face the group, her expression unreadable. She speaks quietly, her voice carrying the weight of the house's history. "You've seen it now," she says, her words sinking deep into their minds. "The house never forgets. And once it has you, it keeps you." The group stands in stunned silence, each person lost in their own thoughts, too shaken to speak. The tour is no longer an adventure. It's become something far darker, something more real than any of them could have imagined. The Whaley House is not just a place of history, it is a place where the past is never truly gone. And for the unfortunate souls who wander too far, it becomes their grave. The guide's eyes flicker with something unspoken, something ancient, as she ushers them toward the exit. "Come on. The house has given you a glimpse of its truth. But it's not done yet. It never is." And as they shuffle out the door, their hearts still racing, they all know one thing for certain: the Whaley House will never let them forget. As the tour progresses, the air in the Whaley House grows heavier, the shadows deepening, as if the very structure of the building is closing in around them. The guide leads them to the main parlor, a room where so much history and tragedy have unfolded. She warns them, her voice trembling ever so slightly, "There's one spirit here who isn't as understanding of visitors." She gestures toward the large, ornate mirror hanging on the far wall, its surface clouded with age and grime. "This mirror," she says, "is said to reflect not just what's in front of it, but what's behind it, or who." The lantern flickers again, casting erratic shadows across the room, and for a split second, The reflection in the mirror doesn't match the room. The group stares at the mirror in stunned silence. For a heartbeat, the room seems to stretch unnaturally distorted and unfamiliar. The soft, suffocating silence is broken by the faintest sound, the creak of floorboards, slow and deliberate, like someone knows something is walking behind them. And then, as if to confirm their worst fears, a cold breeze sweeps through the room. The lantern sputters, dimming further, and in the reflection of the mirror, a shadow appears dark, tall, and unmistakably human. It's a figure, but not one of the tour group. It stands just behind them, its face obscured, its posture rigid and unnatural. The group gasps in unison, turning around to find nothing but empty air. But when they glance back at the mirror, the figure is still there, staring directly at them. Its eyes, dark and hollow, seem to burn with an intensity that sends a wave of cold terror rippling through the room. The guide takes a sharp, unsteady breath. That, she says, barely above a whisper, is the spirit of the man who never left. Before she can finish, the sound of a door slamming somewhere in the house echoes through the walls. A loud, reverberating bang that makes the group jump in shock. The temperature drops even further, and now, the unmistakable scent of burnt tobacco fills the room, suffocating them. Someone stumbles backward, eyes wide with terror, as the figure in the mirror shifts, its face slowly coming into view twisted, a grimace frozen in a half-snarl. The tour group is paralyzed, their eyes locked on the mirror as the figure begins to move toward them, each step a slow, deliberate approach. And then the lantern goes out completely. In the darkness, only the faintest sound remains: the shuffling of footsteps, the creak of the floorboards, and the unmistakable whisper of a voice. "You shouldn't have come here." The silence that follows is deafening, and just when it seems like the figure is about to reach them, everything goes black. Will they ever escape the grip of the Whaley house? Or have they, like so many before them, become another part of its tortured history? The group stands frozen in the narrow hallway, the weight of the house's history pressing down on them. Each creak of the floorboards beneath their feet, each whisper of the wind outside, feels like a reminder that they are intruders in a place that holds onto its memories with an iron grip. The air is thick, alive with the whispers of those who have long since passed, yet their presence is undeniable. The guide motions for them to follow her deeper into the house, but the chill in the air seems to grow colder, more oppressive. They continue down the hallway, their footsteps quickening as the darkness around them deepens. Every turn, every shadow feels wrong, as though the house itself is bending and shifting to trap them, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As they reach the back of the house, where the small parlor and dining room sit, the guide stops, her lantern casting eerie shadows on the walls. "This," she says softly, "is where the house has seen the most death. The hauntings here are particularly strong. It's said that this is where Thomas Whaley met his end, and where Violet's tragic death still lingers. If you listen closely, you might hear the sound of something that shouldn't be here." The air grows thick, and for a moment, there is nothing but silence. But then, the faintest sound, a whisper, no louder than a breath, brushes past their ears. It's followed by another, then another, until the words become unmistakable: "Get out." The voice is chilling, sharp, as if it belongs to someone long dead but very much alive in the house's energy. The group flinches, looking around frantically. Nothing. No one. Just the shadows and the smell of old wood. But then, from the corner of the room, a faint movement catches their eyes. A figure, barely visible, standing in the doorway. It's too dark to make out any features, but the form is unmistakably human. The group backs away, hearts pounding in their chests. But before they can react, the figure steps forward, disappearing into the darkness. A cold wind sweeps through the room, extinguishing the lantern's flame with a sudden gust. In the pitch black, the group stands paralyzed, the weight of the house's haunting presence suffocating them. Every breath feels like it's being drawn from a place far too distant. The sounds of footsteps grow louder, closer, echoing through the rooms as though they're surrounded. Panic sets in. Some try to speak, but their voices are drowned out by the sound of their own rapid breathing. In that moment, it becomes clear the Whaley House is more than just a haunted building. It is a place of passage, a realm where the dead linger, trapped in their eternal loop, waiting for the next soul to wander into their midst. With the flickering of the last light, the guide's voice cuts through the chaos, steady and calm. "It's time to go," she whispers. "Now." As if released from a spell, the group rushes toward the door, stumbling over one another in a frantic attempt to escape the house's grip. The door slams shut behind them, but not before one final, chilling scream echoes from within. The guide, her face pale and cold, watches them retreat into the night, and for a brief moment, a shadow of a figure stands in the doorway. It's Thomas Whaley, staring at them, his eyes filled with an unreadable sorrow. When the group finally reaches the street, gasping for air and shaking with fear, they glance back. The Whaley house stands as it always has, still, dark, and silent. But beneath that silence, the house still remembers. And it always will. The tourists leave San Diego, but the Whaley house remains. Its hauntings don't end with the tour, they never do. For those who dare to walk its halls, there is no escaping the grip of the past, a past that will always reach out and demand to be remembered. And as the moon rises high over the city, the Whaley house waits for the next group of curious souls to arrive, ready to share its secrets. It was Halloween night, the perfect occasion for a young couple seeking adventure. They had arrived in Long Beach, California, eager for a romantic, thrilling getaway aboard the legendary Queen Mary. With its sleek, towering profile against the dusky sky, the ship looked like a ghost from a bygone era. Its towering silhouette loomed over the harbor, casting a shadow over the surrounding area, as fog crept along the water like an ancient spirit awakening from a deep slumber. The Queen Mary, once the pride of the Cunard Line, had been transformed into a hotel and museum, its storied past forever etched into the walls of its grand halls. The young couple marveled at the elegance of the ship's Art Deco interiors, the gleaming brass fixtures, the polished wood, and the history it exuded from every inch. To them, it seemed like the perfect Halloween destination where the ghosts of the past mixed with the excitement of the present. They expected an evening of spooky fun, surrounded by vintage charm, and maybe a few ghostly whispers thrown in for good measure. But they were about to learn that the Queen Mary's haunted legacy was not some playful ghost story to be shrugged off, it was a living nightmare that had trapped many who wandered too deep into its dark past. As the couple boarded the ship, the air was thick with anticipation. They passed through the grand lobby, admiring the intricate details of the ship's design. The faint hum of the engines could be heard in the distance, though the ship was no longer in service. The ship's grandeur, however, was marred by an undercurrent of unease that lingered, just beneath the surface. The creaking of the ship's old timbers, the faint whistling of wind through the upper decks, all seemed to carry a certain weight, something that hinted at darker, older stories than the ones they had read about in brochures. Once aboard, they quickly heard the rumors. Word spread fast on the Queen Mary about Door 13, a place where death and tragedy had stained the ship's history. It was said to be cursed. The door was a chilling reminder of the night a sailor had tragically lost his life, crushed by a heavy door in the engine room during the ship's final voyage. It was said that he had been trying to close it, struggling against the wind and weight of the massive door, when it suddenly slammed shut. His screams echoed throughout the chamber as he was crushed, and though the ship was filled with people, no one was close enough to save him. The young couple had heard the stories, the strange noises near the door, the cold spots in the engine room, the flickering lights. But they laughed it off as nothing more than Halloween exaggerations. "Who believes in ghosts, anyway?" the boyfriend said with a grin, trying to keep the mood light. "We'll just check it out and say we saw it for ourselves." Their plan was simple: find Door 13, stand near it, and see if anything strange happened. They were curious, but they didn't really believe. After all, it was just a story, right? But as they ventured deeper into the ship, something started to feel wrong. At first, it was just a sense of heaviness in the air, a slight chill that crept up on them as they wandered through the eerily quiet hallways. The ship, usually so full of life and activity, was oddly still. Their footsteps echoed off the walls, reverberating through the seemingly endless maze of corridors. The noise of the ship, the hum of machinery, the chatter of guests, the clinking of glasses was strangely absent, leaving behind a hollow silence that made every movement feel louder than it should. The couple continued their search for door 13, laughing nervously at each other's exaggerated stories about the hauntings. But as they rounded a corner and caught sight of the door, the temperature dropped suddenly. It wasn't just a draft, they could feel it in their bones, a bone-deep chill that sank into their skin like ice water. The lights above them flickered, casting the hallway into shadows that seemed to stretch longer and longer, as though the ship was growing darker around them. The air became thick and suffocating, as though it didn't want them to move forward. The couple stood before the door, hesitant now, but still caught in the thrill of the unknown. The girl, clutching her boyfriend's arm, glanced at the door, her breath visible in the suddenly freezing air. "It's just a door," she whispered, though her voice trembled. "Nothing will happen." But as she spoke, she felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The shadows around them seemed to deepen, drawing them in. The corridor ahead was lined with doors, but there was something unnerving about the way this particular door loomed in the distance. It seemed to stand alone, isolated from the rest. A low hum vibrated through the floor, almost imperceptible at first. Then the sound grew louder, a deep, resonating vibration that seemed to come from below them. The ship's engines. Or something far darker. The boyfriend stepped forward, eager to prove his bravery. He reached out for the door handle, but as his hand made contact, it felt wrong. The door was freezing cold, colder than anything they had felt inside the ship, and the sensation was unlike any chill they had ever experienced. "I think we should go," the girl murmured, her voice suddenly shaky, her heart pounding in her chest. But before they could turn away, a loud bang echoed from within the engine room, so deafening it made the entire ship tremble beneath their feet. And just like that, the haunting silence was broken, replaced by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind them. The couple froze. There was no one else nearby, the entire hallway was empty. But the sound of footsteps continued, growing louder and closer. The sense of dread was unbearable. Whatever had happened at door 13 was not just a story, it was real. The ship was alive with ghosts, and the Queen Mary had begun to stir. The air around them grew heavier, thick with a tension that seemed to pulse from the very walls. The couple tried to laugh it off, nervously glancing at each other, but the weight of the moment kept growing. The hallway was quiet again, too quiet, as if the ship had exhaled and now held its breath, waiting. The soft glow from the antique lamps flickered overhead, casting long, wavering shadows across the floor. It felt like the ship itself was watching them. They glanced back at the door. The cold seemed to seep deeper into their bones. The ship had been built to withstand the most turbulent of seas, but nothing in its long history could have prepared it for the horrors that had happened aboard. The couple, still unsure of what they were feeling, continued their journey down the winding hallway, not yet willing to turn back. They had heard the stories, of course. Everyone had. The Queen Mary had always been known for its beautiful interiors, its luxurious past, but it was also a place steeped in tragedy. Lives had been lost here, during its time as a wartime transport ship, during its final days of service, and in the years that followed, when it had been converted into a hotel and museum. The Queen Mary wasn't just a ship, it was a mausoleum of forgotten souls. And, tonight, it seemed like it was remembering them all at once. With each step, The temperature dropped even further, and soon, the couple could see their breath-forming clouds in front of them, vapor in the stifling air. They hadn't noticed before, but the eerie silence was almost suffocating now, as if the ship itself was holding its secrets just beneath the surface, ready to spill them at any moment. Then came the noise again. At first, it was distant, almost imperceptible, the unmistakable sound of footsteps following them, one slow step at a time, matching their own rhythm. But when they turned around, the hallway was still empty. No one was there. No one but them. A wave of unease swept over them as they quickened their pace, but the footsteps kept getting louder, closer. Each echo against the cold walls made their hearts race. There was no mistaking it now. Someone, or something, was following them. The girl gripped her boyfriend's arm tighter, her pulse quickening. "What is that?" she whispered, voice trembling. "Maybe just another guest," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He turned his head, scanning the dimly lit hallway behind them. But there was nothing. Just the deep shadows and the faint, unnerving hum of the ship's underbelly, as if it were alive with secrets. But as they reached the end of the hallway, the ship seemed to exhale with a low groan, as if in response to their unease. The temperature plummeted further, and a sudden, unexplainable chill wrapped around them, biting through their jackets and skin. It was as though the ship was trying to get their attention. And it had succeeded. The hairs on the back of their necks stood on end as they came face to face with door 13, its cold, weathered exterior looming before them, almost as if daring them to enter. It had been locked off for years, or so they were told, but tonight, the door seemed strangely inviting. The ship's silence enveloped them, the footsteps behind them now a distant memory, yet their hearts still raced. The couple stood there for a moment, unsure whether to turn back or push forward. But something far deeper than curiosity, urged them onward. They were no longer in control. The Queen Mary had them now. As they stood before door 13, the couple couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was watching them. The ship's creaks and groans, which had initially seemed like the normal sounds of an old vessel, now took on an ominous tone, as though the Queen Mary was alive and aware of their presence. It wasn't just the isolation of the hallway or the chill in the air. It was the quiet pressure, the silent command of the ship's haunted past. It was the weight of the souls trapped aboard her for decades. The boyfriend, trying to maintain his cool, placed his hand on the door again, his fingers trembling slightly as they wrapped around the cold metal. The air around them seemed to thicken, as though the ship itself was holding its breath. With a deep, steadying breath, he pushed against the door, but it didn't budge. It was stuck frozen, as though something was keeping it shut from the other side. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of their breathing seemed too loud in the oppressive silence. The girl, now feeling a knot tighten in her stomach, glanced around, feeling as though something or someone was just beyond their line of sight. There was a pressure in the air, as if the darkness itself was drawing closer. Then, suddenly, the lights flickered, and in the brief moment of dimness, they heard it, a distant, low murmur. At first, it was nothing more than a whisper, but it grew louder, clearer, like a voice, a whisper that seemed to crawl from the shadows and brush against their skin. "Leave." The word echoed in the dim corridor. It wasn't a voice from the air. It wasn't a creak of the ship. It was something far more personal, something that came from deep within the bowels of the Queen Mary. The couple instinctively stepped back, their hearts pounding. The boyfriend cursed under his breath, and the girl grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin. The voice had been so clear, so real, it felt as if someone was standing right behind them, breathing down their necks. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He nodded but said nothing. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously toward the dark hallway behind them. The air had grown heavier with each passing second, suffocating them. The temperature seemed to drop even further, sending an icy shiver down their spines. There was another sound this time. It was unmistakable. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, coming closer and closer, echoing in the stillness of the hall. It wasn't just the sound of someone walking down the corridor, it was the sound of something that had been waiting for them, something that had been walking these halls for decades. The boyfriend spun around, his pulse racing, but there was no one there. The hallway remained empty, save for the darkened corners and the fading light that cast long, unnatural shadows on the floor. The footsteps continued, but they had no source. Suddenly, the door to the engine room behind them creaked open. The sound was slow, agonizing, as if it had been dragged open against its will. The girl gasped and clutched her boyfriend's arm tighter. The door was opening on its own, and the heavy darkness within seemed to beckon them closer. "No, this isn't right." The boyfriend's voice was barely a whisper, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the ship's dark past. "Let's go. Now." But just as they turned to leave, a cold draft swept over them, freezing the air in their lungs. The temperature dropped so quickly that they could see their breath, forming fog in the eerie quiet. And that's when they heard it, a low growl, like something between a snarl and a groan, reverberating from deep within the ship. The sound of it vibrated through the floors, rattling the walls, as if the ship itself was alive and restless, enraged by their intrusion. The couple froze, unable to move, trapped between the door to the engine room, now wide open, and the invisible force that seemed to be pushing them into its darkness. That's when they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps again. But this time, they were directly behind them. The couple stood frozen in the middle of the hallway, their eyes wide, breaths shallow. The footsteps were unmistakable, slow, heavy, and deliberate, as though someone, or something, was walking toward them. But the hallway around them remained empty, devoid of any living soul. The boyfriend's heart began to pound in his chest, his earlier bravado slipping away as the sound of those footsteps grew louder, closer. He spun around, his eyes darting down the long, dim corridor, but there was no one to be seen. Only shadows stretched out from the doorways, and the faint creak of old wood echoed from somewhere deep within the ship. "Did you hear that?" the girl whispered, her voice trembling now. She clutched his arm tighter, her fingers cold against his skin. He nodded, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "It's just the ship, old pipes, or the wind," but even as he said the words, he knew they were empty. The sound of footsteps wasn't the wind, and the chill in the air wasn't a draft. It felt deliberate, as though they were being followed by something that had no intention of letting them go. As they stood in the hallway, the air seemed to thicken around them, becoming heavier, harder to breathe. Their every exhale hung in the air like smoke, dissipating slowly, only to be replaced by another, colder breath. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and it felt as though they had walked into a freezing mist that clung to their skin, sending a shiver down their spines. The boyfriend turned back to the door, his mind racing. "Maybe we should just check the engine room," he suggested, his voice tight, as if he was trying to convince himself more than her. He took a hesitant step toward the door, his fingers brushing the cold metal of the handle once again. But this time, the door felt even colder, the temperature almost unbearable. He pulled his hand back quickly, startled. "Something's wrong," the girl whispered. "We need to leave. Now." Her voice was barely audible, but it was full of panic now. She could feel it too, the weight in the air, the feeling of being watched. Every inch of the ship seemed to be alive with malevolent energy, as though it were trapping them in this moment, preventing them from leaving. The footsteps that had once seemed distant now echoed so loudly in the hall that it felt as though the figure was right behind them, breathing down their necks. Suddenly, the ship seemed to groan beneath their feet, the sound of metal shifting and grinding, as if the Queen Mary itself was alive, protesting their presence. A harsh, shrill clang of metal reverberated through the corridor, and for a split second, the lights above them flickered violently, plunging them into near darkness. Then, as if to make the atmosphere even more oppressive, the faintest sound of a whisper drifted through the air. It was so soft, almost imperceptible, yet it carried a chill that sank deep into their bones. The words were just on the edge of hearing, but they both felt it, the unmistakable sensation that someone, or something, was speaking to them. No one leaves. The whisper was not just a voice, it was a command, a warning. It hung in the air between them, wrapping around them like an invisible hand, pulling at their very souls. They turned toward each other, wide-eyed and pale, unable to shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that something was in the room with them. The footsteps had stopped. But the feeling of being watched didn't. The boyfriend took a shaky step back, his mind racing. "We need to get out of here," he said urgently, his voice cracking as he tried to maintain his composure. "This isn't funny anymore." He grabbed her hand, but as he turned to run, he froze. At the end of the hallway, just past door 13, a figure stood in the shadows. It was tall, its outline vague and distorted by the dim lighting. But the one thing that was clear was the uniform, the dark, faded sailor's uniform that clung to the figure like it had been worn for decades. The girl gasped, clutching his arm harder. "What the hell is that?" The figure didn't move, its gaze fixed on them, unmoving, silent. The couple's breath caught in their throats. The figure seemed to fade in and out of existence, as if it were struggling to maintain its form. It was there, then it wasn't, like a mirage or a memory that couldn't quite stay in the present. And just when they thought they might be imagining things, the figure took one slow, deliberate step toward them. Another. Then another. The temperature dropped even further, the air thickening, and the floor beneath their feet seemed to groan under the pressure of unseen forces. The cold had become unbearable now, their breaths visible in the air, each exhale freezing as it left their lips. Their hands were numb, their hearts pounding in their chests as fear set in. And then, the figure spoke. The voice was faint, but unmistakable. "You're not welcome here." It wasn't a whisper this time, it was a harsh, guttural voice, one that sent a jolt of terror through their bodies. It was as though the ship itself had spoken to them, as if it had its own will, its own desires. And those desires were clear: it didn't want them to leave.